The universe, in its infinite arrogance, rarely asks permission before it breaks its own rules. At 0347 hours, Cheyenne Mountain was running a skeleton crew. The kind of quiet that only exists in the hours before dawn, coffee going stale in the break room, Walter Harriman fighting a losing battle against sleep at the gate console, two SFs playing cards somewhere down the corridor. General Hammond had authorized the experiment under protest, signing off on Carter's proposal with the kind of resigned pragmatism that came from years of watching his base defy the laws of physics on a near-weekly basis, an experimental dimensional probe. Low risk, Carter had said. Contained energy signature, McKay had added, with the particular confidence of a man who had never once been entirely right about anything being contained. The Infinity sat in the expanded bay, a vessel unlike anything in SGC's inventory. Not Goa'uld, not Asgard, not purely ancient. It was Carter's obsession made metal, a hybrid frame built around a salvaged Teltac hull, retrofitted with a Naquadah-enhanced drive system, and at its core, a zero-point module running at 340% above recommended operational parameters. McKay had called it beautifully insane. Carter had called it theoretically viable. Hammond had called it a Tuesday. The plan was simple: a controlled dimensional membrane probe. Not travel, not retrieval, just a knock on the door between realities. A sonar ping into parallel space to measure resonance frequencies. The Infinity would charge, briefly open a micro breach, gather readings, and return to standby. 6 minutes total. At 0347 hours and 12 seconds, the zero-point module did something no one had modeled. It sneezed. The energy spike hit 800% in 0.3 seconds. The Infinity lurched inside its bay like a living thing startled awake. The dimensional membrane didn't just crack, it shattered. 4 separate breach points tearing open simultaneously around the ship's hull like wounds in the fabric of everything. The gate room's proximity alarms didn't know what to make of it. They screamed anyway. Walter Harriman was fully awake before the sound registered. "We have an unscheduled," he stopped. Every screen on his console was showing readings that had no category. "We have everything." Inside the Infinity, for exactly 11 seconds, the ship existed in 4 dimensions at once. The continent smelled like pine resin and blood. Geralt of Rivia had smelled worse. He had the griffin pinned against the cliff face, both silver blades drawn, the creature's left wing already hanging useless from a sign-enhanced grapple. It was screaming that particular frequency that meant it knew it was losing. Geralt had learned to find that sound efficient rather than satisfying. Efficiency was the point. The contract was straightforward. The coin was already spent in his head. He was 2 moves from finished. Then the air to his left split open. Not like magic. He knew magic. He knew the ozone and copper smell of a portal, the way chaos energy folded space into a doorway with visible effort. This was different. This was the universe reaching through a hole it had punched in itself, and the hand that came through had no interest in being polite. The griffin forgot. Geralt spun toward the light, white and vicious, nothing like any breach he'd encountered, and had exactly enough time to register that whatever this was, it was pulling before the mountain. The griffin, the pine resin, and the blood were simply gone. Ellen Ripley had 17 seconds left on her motion tracker when the wall behind her ceased to exist. The hive was 3 corridors back and closing fast. She had 1 pulse rifle at 40% charge, a flare she was saving for a last resort she'd decided she wouldn't use, and the specific calm of someone who has already died once and found the experience instructive. The tracker was painting 11 contacts, then 12. Then the white light erased the numbers entirely and Ripley was elsewhere. The tracker still counting contacts that weren't there anymore, her trigger finger still depressed against a threat that had been replaced by the interior of a ship she didn't recognize. She swept the room in 1.4 seconds. No xenomorphs, no eggs, unknown vessel, humanish construction, unfamiliar power signature. She lowered the rifle 2 inches, then raised it again when she heard movement behind her. T'Challa had been mid-sentence. The Wakandan diplomatic shuttle was holding in low orbit above the Horn of Africa, and he had been explaining with the particular patience of a king who had learned that patience was sometimes the sharpest weapon, why the UN's proposed resolution was structurally flawed in 4 distinct ways. His aide had been taking notes. The shuttle's pilot had been maintaining polite disinterest. The light came through the viewport first. T'Challa recognized it for what it was, not before he recognized what it was. Not a weapon, not an atmospheric event. Something reaching in. The panther habit, the one Shuri called paranoid and he called alive, activated without thought. The suit flooded from the necklace across his body in a ripple of vibranium nanotechnology, kinetic absorption protocols engaging, and T'Challa stepped toward the light rather than away from it, because kings do not retreat from the unknown. He landed inside the Infinity in a combat crouch, the suit already reading 0 threats but cataloging everything, and found himself looking at a white woman holding a very large gun pointed at his head. "Nice suit," Ripley said, not lowering the rifle. "Yours as well," T'Challa replied, nodding at her armor. "Though I suspect we are both in the wrong place." Din Djarin had been 3 seconds from the jump to hyperspace. The bounty was secured a Klatooinian arms dealer, restrained in the Razor Crest's holding cell, complaining about his wrist bindings with the enthusiasm of someone who hadn't yet accepted his situation. Grogu was in his pod, half asleep, one ear twitching at the restrained bounty's complaints with what Din had learned to read as mild irritation. The nav computer had the coordinates locked. It was, by the standards of his profession, a good day. The energy that hit the Razor Crest felt like nothing he had a word for. Not an ion cannon, not a tractor beam, not any Imperial or First Order technology he'd encountered. It went through the Beskar like it wasn't there, and Beskar didn't let things through, and the cockpit was suddenly white, and the stars were suddenly gone, and Din had both blasters drawn and Grogu's pod sealed, before the light resolved into the interior of an unfamiliar ship. The bounty was still in the hold. Din checked. Then he checked the sealed pod. Then he checked the unknown ship around him with the systematic thoroughness of a man whose entire life philosophy had been forged in the discipline of checking everything twice. 2 other people were already here. A man in a black technological suit that read Mandalorian to Din's eye armor that moved like water, and a woman in tactical gear holding a weapon he didn't recognize pointed at the suited man. Neither was an immediate threat. Both were alert. Din holstered one blaster. Keep the other. Then the 4th arrival came through. Geralt hit the deck of the Infinity already rolling, both swords clearing their scabbards before he'd finished moving, the silver blade up and the steel blade covering his blind side by pure reflex. He came out of the roll in a low stance, cat sign active, pupils blown wide to drink every available photon of light in the unfamiliar space. He cataloged metal walls, unknown architecture, 2 humans in unusual armor, 1 human in a full-face helmet holding a weapon pointed at the floor. The smell was wrong recycled air, machine oil, something chemical he had no reference for, no chaos energy, no signs of magic, no visible threat. He straightened slowly, did not sheathe the swords. "Where?" he said, in the tone he used for Witcher contracts that had been fundamentally misrepresented, "is this?" Nobody had an answer, because at that precise moment, the Infinity dropped back into normal space at approximately 40 kilometers above Cheyenne Mountain, Colorado, and began falling. The impact alarms in the SGC had a specific escalation protocol. Walter Harriman had triggered Level 1, unscheduled gate activation, Level 2, unknown energy signature, unscheduled, and Level 3, unauthorized vehicle in restricted airspace in under 90 seconds. By the time General Hammond reached the control room, still buttoning his jacket, the Infinity had deployed emergency braking thrusters. Carter had at least built those to work independently and was settling into a controlled crash landing in the mountain's upper vehicle bay with a sound like God, dropping his cutlery. "Get me Carter," Hammond said. "She's already inside it, sir," Walter said. He paused. "Also, we're reading 4 separate biosigns aboard that weren't there when it launched." Hammond looked at him. "Human?" he asked. Walter looked at his readings with the expression of a man who had been doing this long enough to understand that mostly was a complete answer. "Mostly, sir. The iris on the vehicle bay is sealed. 6 SFs, moved to containment positions." Hammond clasped his hands behind his back and walked toward the bay with the stride of a man who had met Ra, Apophis, and a version of himself from a parallel timeline, and was therefore not going to be rattled by 4 unexpected houseguests. SG-1 was assembled in the briefing room 12 minutes later. Jack O'Neill had coffee. This was, Carter privately noted, either a good sign or a sign that he'd decided caffeine was an appropriate response to the apocalypse, which, in her experience, could mean either thing. "What are we looking at?" Jack said. Carter pulled up the readings on the briefing room screen. 4 biosigns, 4 wildly different physiological profiles. The Infinity's internal sensors had captured 17 seconds of footage before the crash landing had taken the secondary systems offline, and what the footage showed had produced a silence in the room that lasted nearly 4 seconds, which, for this team, was geological. "That's a man in a full-face helmet with what appears to be Mandalorian-style armor," Daniel said carefully, "and a woman with a weapon I don't recognize, and a man in what reads as advanced nanotechnology, and," he leaned forward, "is that man carrying 2 swords?" "Medieval?" Jack offered. "The scans say the blades have silver content consistent with high-purity alloy, not decorative. They've been used," Daniel paused, "recently." Teal'c looked at the screen with the measured attention he brought to all tactical assessments. "They arrived through the dimensional breach," he said. It was not a question. "The Infinity punched through 4 separate membranes," Carter said. "Each one corresponds to a different dimensional resonance frequency. It's like imagine the ship as a boat, the dimensional membranes as nets, and it drove through 4 of them simultaneously and pulled these 4 individuals along with it when it snapped back." End quote. "So we kidnapped them," Jack said. "Accidentally. Hammond's going to love that." In the vehicle bay below, behind 6 inches of reinforced steel door and an SF team with very large guns, 4 people from 4 different realities stood in the cargo hold of the Infinity and reached the same conclusion by 4 completely different routes. Wherever they were, whoever had brought them here, they were going to need to deal with it directly. Geralt sheathed his steel sword, but kept the silver. Ripley kept the pulse rifle up. T'Challa stood at parade rest, the vibranium suit still active, reading the room. Din Djarin checked Grogu's pod one more time, confirmed the child was still sealed and sleeping, and then walked to the cargo hold door and knocked on it 3 times. "I know you're out there," he said. "Open the door. We need to talk." The silence from the other side lasted exactly 2 seconds. Then General Hammond's voice came through the intercom, with the tone of a man who had genuinely seen everything and had arrived at a place beyond surprise. "SFs, stand down to observe. Doctor. Jackson, get down here. We apparently need a translator." "I speak English," Din said through the door. Another pause. "Everyone speaks English?" From somewhere behind Din, Geralt of Rivia, who had learned more languages than most scholars would see in 3 lifetimes, said flatly. Evidently, Hammond's sigh was audible, even through the intercom. "Open the door." The light from the corridor flooded in, and 4 people who had never heard of the Stargate program looked out at a mountain full of soldiers, alien technology, and a circular ring that hummed with the energy of 10,000 worlds and the Stargate universe, looked back, already calculating how much it was about to change. If you want to see more characters pulled from impossible places into impossible universes, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a character and the universe you'd want to see them in down in the comments below. Indeed. General Hammond had a rule, unwritten and unspoken, but understood by every person who had ever served under him at Cheyenne Mountain. When the impossible walked through your door, you offered it a chair and a cup of coffee before you pointed weapons at it. The weapons came later, if necessary. The coffee came first. It was, he had found, a reliable indicator of intent. Most things that wanted to destroy you didn't want coffee. He was about to discover that the rule needed updating for visitors who hadn't walked through his door so much as fallen through the ceiling of his reality. The vehicle bay had been reconfigured into a functional holding space in the 12 minutes between the Infinity's landing and Hammond's arrival at the door. Portable lighting rigs had replaced the overhead systems the crash had knocked out. A folding table had been produced from somewhere. The SGC had a remarkable supply of folding tables. A fact that had never struck Daniel Jackson as significant until this moment, and 6 SFs stood at measured intervals around the perimeter, weapons lowered but present. The 4 arrivals had arranged themselves without instruction in a formation that Daniel, watching from the doorway, recognized immediately as tactical. The helmeted figure anchored the left, a compact sealed pod at his feet that emitted occasional soft sounds suggesting something alive inside. The woman in tactical gear held the right flank, her weapon now lowered but her grip unchanged, the specific readiness of someone who had learned that relaxing prematurely was a category error. The man in the nanotechnology suit stood at center with the easy stillness of someone accustomed to being the most composed person in any room. And the man with the swords, who was watching everything with pale, inhuman eyes that caught the light in a way that made the nearest SF unconsciously step back, stood slightly apart from the others, which Daniel read not as hostility, but as the body language of a man who had survived a long time by maintaining independent options. Hammond entered first. Daniel followed. Carter was still running diagnostics on the Infinity systems and would join them when the ship stopped trying to tell her things she didn't have words for yet. Jack came last, coffee in hand, projecting the particular energy of a man who was paying extremely close attention while appearing to pay none at all. "I'm General George Hammond," Hammond said. "This is Stargate Command, located inside Cheyenne Mountain, Colorado, United States of America, Earth." He paused. "I recognize that the last part may require some context." The woman spoke first. "Ellen Ripley, Warrant Officer, Wayland Yutani Corporation." A beat. Former. Very formal. She looked at the ceiling, then at the floor, then at Hammond, with the eyes of someone performing a rapid environmental assessment. "What year is it?" 2003, Hammond said. Something moved behind Ripley's expression. Not relief exactly. Recalibration. "Different timeline," she said, more to herself than anyone. "Different branch." She seemed to find this acceptable. "Okay." The man in the suit stepped forward and inclined his head with the measured formality of someone for whom dignity was a discipline rather than a performance. "T'Challa, King of Wakanda." He paused fractionally, "though I suspect that designation carries different weight in your world than in mine." Jack looked at Daniel. Daniel looked at his notepad. "Wakanda," Daniel said carefully, "in our world, is a nation in East Africa that the world largely believes to be agrarian," T'Challa said. His expression didn't change, but something behind it did. "I see. The divergence point may be significant." "We can discuss geopolitics," Hammond said, with the voice of a man filing that for later, once we've established some basics. He turned to the helmeted figure. A pause. The voice that came from behind the Beskar was measured and unhurried. Din Djarin. He looked around the room, cataloging exits and threat vectors in the systematic way that Hammond recognized from every Special Forces soldier he'd ever commanded. The child in the pod isn't a threat. He stays with me. Understood, Hammond said, because he was a general who had learned when to pick battles. Everyone looked at Geralt. Geralt looked back at all of them with the expression of a man who had dealt with more political negotiations than anyone looking at him would guess, and who had learned that the fastest way through most of them was direct truth delivered without decoration. Geralt of Rivia, he said. Witcher, I hunt monsters for coins. He let that sit for a moment. I'm going to need someone to explain what a Stargate is, why it smells like naquadah, whatever that is, and what exactly you were doing that pulled me out of a Griffin contract. The silence lasted approximately 1.8 seconds. You can smell the naquadah? Carter said from the doorway, datapad in hand, having arrived 30 seconds ago and been waiting for the right moment. She looked genuinely fascinated. That's the mineral has a very specific atomic structure the olfactory identification would require. She caught Hammond's look. We can discuss that later. We'll discuss everything later, Jack said pleasantly. Right now, let's try the coffee. The debrief took 4 hours. Daniel ran it, because Daniel was the person the SGC defaulted to when the situation required someone who could absorb genuinely world-altering information and respond with curiosity rather than bureaucratic paralysis. He was, Jack had once noted, constitutionally unsuited to being appropriately alarmed by things. Daniel had taken this as a compliment. The 4 arrivals were separated into individual rooms for initial questioning, standard protocol, designed to prevent story alignment before independent accounts could be gathered. Jack handled Ripley because Ripley had the most immediately legible frame of reference. She was a soldier, or close enough, from a human military culture, dealing with alien threats that the SGC had analogs for. The xenomorphs were not the Goa'uld, but the structural similarity of a parasitic organism treating human biology as a resource was not lost on either of them. The symbiote, Ripley said, when Jack had explained the Goa'uld at a basic level. It uses the host's nervous system, controls motor function, cognition, full suppression in most cases, Jack confirmed. The host is aware, just not in charge. Ripley was quiet for a moment. That's worse than my version, she said finally. Yeah, Jack said. We think so too. Carter took T'Challa because T'Challa had asked, with polite precision, to speak to whoever built the hybrid ship, and Carter had walked in to find him studying her engineering notes on the Infinity with the focused attention of someone who understood what they were looking at. The conversation shifted within 15 minutes from debrief to technical dialogue, because T'Challa's vibranium research had produced energy absorption models that were, Carter noted with growing excitement, directly applicable to the ZPM stability problem that had been keeping her up at night. Your 0-point module, T'Challa said, is oscillating at a frequency that the vibranium lattice structure would naturally dampen. If the nanostructure of the suit were adapted to interface with the ZPM housing, the energy bleed that caused the dimensional breach could be controlled, Carter finished. They looked at each other with the mutual recognition of 2 engineers who had just found someone working on the same problem from a different angle. I would like, T'Challa said carefully, to understand exactly what this facility does before I contribute further. Carter told him. The full version, from the first mission through the Goa'uld Wars to the current Anubis situation. T'Challa listened without interrupting, which Carter found unusual. Most people interrupted Apophis. False gods, T'Challa said when she finished. Beings who claimed divinity to justify dominion over human populations. That's the short version, yeah. Wakanda has no equivalent in our world. He paused. But I understand the principle. The dangerous ones are always the ones who believe their own mythology. Daniel's sessions with Geralt and Din Djarin ran simultaneously, and produced results he hadn't expected. Din Djarin's frame of reference was, structurally, the most compatible with the SGC's. He existed in a galaxy-spanning civilization with multiple alien species, advanced technology, military and political factions competing for dominance, and a foundational understanding that the universe was large and mostly indifferent. The SGC's situation Earth as a nascent player in a galactic political structure it had barely begun to understand, mapped onto the post-Empire landscape he'd navigated his entire adult life with enough fidelity that he was asking operational questions within 40 minutes. The Goa'uld use Jaffa as soldiers, he said. Soldiers who believe they're serving gods. Most of them, yes. Some have broken away. They're called the Free Jaffa. Din processed this. Like Mandalorians who stopped serving the Empire. He nodded once, the sharp nod of someone filing new information into existing categories. And these Free Jaffa, their allies? Complicated allies, Daniel said. Like most of our allies. That's just allies, Din said. Daniel smiled, for the first time in the debrief. Yes, that's just allies. Geralt, in the adjacent room, had a different conversation entirely. The Witcher had listened to Daniel's explanation of the Stargate, the Goa'uld, the Gate Network, and Earth's position in the galaxy with the specific quality of attention Daniel had learned to recognize in people who had survived by reading situations faster than the situations read them. He asked almost no questions during the explanation. He waited until it was finished. Then he said, "The Ancients, these beings who built the gates and then ascended to a higher form of existence." "That's correct," Daniel said. "They don't interfere. They have a non-interference policy when ascending, yes. There are exceptions. There are always exceptions." Geralt's pale eyes were steady. "In my world, we call them the Ain El, the elder races. Beings of tremendous power who claim non-interference as philosophy while interfering in ways that serve their own purposes." He paused. "They're not different from gods. They're just more honest about not caring." Daniel stared at him, then wrote 3 lines in his notepad very quickly. That's actually a very useful framework for something I've been trying to articulate about ascended behavior for about 4 years. Geralt looked at the notepad. "You study them." "I study everything. It's a problem." For the first time, something shifted in Geralt's expression that was not quite a smile, but occupied the same neighborhood. "So do I," he said. "It's how witches stay alive." The full group reconvened in the SGC briefing room at 0900 hours, seated around the same table that had hosted negotiations with Tokra, arguments with NID oversight, and at least 3 conversations that had technically altered the course of human history. Hammond sat at the head. SG-1 flanked him. The 4 arrivals took the remaining seats with the varied body language of people processing the same situation through completely different filters. Grogu's pod sat beside Din Djarin's chair. It had opened during the walk to the briefing room, and the child, green, large-eared, enormous dark eyes cataloging everything, had been visible for approximately 4 seconds before every person in the corridor had stopped walking. Jack O'Neill had looked at the child for a long moment. "Asgard?" he'd said. "No," Dean had said flatly. "You sure?" "Because I'm sure." Grogu had looked at Jack with the ancient, placid attention of something that was much older than it appeared. Jack had looked back. Then, Grogu had made a small sound and reached toward Jack's coffee. "Don't," Din and Jack said simultaneously. They glanced at each other. Something had been established. In the briefing room, Hammond laid it out plainly. The Infinity's dimensional breach had been detected, not just by the SGC's own monitoring systems, by someone else. Close quote. Carter pulled up the sensor readings from the last 6 hours. A Hatak, a Goa'uld mothership, had dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the solar system 40 minutes ago. It was holding position beyond Pluto, running passive scans. No aggressive posture, no communication, just watching. Anubis, Teal'c said. It was not a question. The energy signature of the dimensional breach is unlike anything in the Milky Way, Carter said. It reads as a power source that's orders of magnitude beyond anything the Goa'uld have encountered. To Anubis, who already has access to partial ancient knowledge, she pulled up a second display. It would look like Earth just turned on an ancient superweapon. So he's not attacking, Jack said. Not yet. He's assessing. How long do we have? Ripley asked. The tactical directness of it cut across the room, and Hammond looked at her, with the recognition one soldier gives another. If Anubis's pattern holds, Carter said, he'll gather intelligence for approximately 72 hours before committing to a course of action. He's half ascended, he thinks, in longer time frames than most Goa'uld. 72 hours, T'Challa said. To do what, exactly? Hammond folded his hands on the table. To figure out how 4 people from 4 separate dimensions are going to help us convince a half-ascended false god that what he detected isn't worth the cost of taking. The room was quiet for a moment. Geralt looked at the sensor display, showing the distant Hatak. Then he looked at Hammond. You want to negotiate from strength, he said slowly. Show him the power is real. But the price of reaching for it is higher than the reward. That's a more elegant summary than I managed in my last 3 briefings, Daniel said. Monsters understand cost, Geralt said simply. You just have to make the cost visible. Din Djarin looked at the Hatak on the screen with the flat assessment of a man who had operated in the shadow of the Empire long enough to understand the arithmetic of intimidation. 1 ship, he said, holding position, waiting for us to show our hand, or for us to show our fear, Teal'c said. Din looked at Teal'c. Something passed between them, the mutual recognition of 2 people who understood that particular calculation from the inside. Then we don't, Din said. Hammond nodded slowly, the beginnings of something that wasn't quite a plan but was the essential precondition of 4 strangers in a room, beginning to think like a team, settled over the briefing table, like the first light of a very complicated dawn. Get some rest, Hammond said. All of you. We have 71 hours and 40 minutes. He stood, which meant the briefing was over. Dr. Jackson will show you to quarters. Eat something. Dr. Fraser will want physicals. He glanced at Din Djarin. For those amenable. Aye. The helmet stays on, Din said. I'll tell Janet, Jack said, with the tone of a man already looking forward to that conversation. As the room cleared, Grogu's pod drifted forward 3 inches toward Geralt of Rivia, attracted by something only the child could perceive. Geralt looked down at it. The large dark eyes looked up at him. The Witcher crouched to the child's eye level, with a careful, non-threatening movement he used around animals that hadn't decided about him yet. Geralt said. Grogu made a small sound. Same, Geralt said, and stood. Din Djarin watched this exchange without expression. Then he picked up the pod and followed Daniel Jackson into the corridors of Cheyenne Mountain, and somewhere above them, 80 million kilometers past the orbit of Pluto, Anubis waited, and in his waiting, made the first of several significant miscalculations. The first gate address Daniel proposed was P3X 774, a mid-range agricultural world in the Milky Way's outer arm. Human population descended from Goa'uld transplants 3,000 years back. Currently unoccupied by any system lord and recently cleared by MALP reconnaissance, low threat profile, stable atmosphere, a good first step through the gate for people who had never used one. Jack vetoed it in under 4 seconds. Anubis has eyes on us, he said, leaning against the gate room doorframe with his arms crossed. We send a team through a milk-run planet. He reads it as routine operations, nothing to worry about. We need him to see something that makes him reconsider the cost-benefit of moving on Earth. You want to use the gate travel itself as a message, T'Challa said. I want to use everything as a message, Jack said. That's Tuesday around here. The address he proposed instead was P7J 989, a world in the middle belt of Goa'uld-claimed space that had recently changed hands. Baal had held it, then lost it in a System Lord skirmish, and in the power vacuum it had become a waypoint for Jaffa patrols from 3 different System Lords, none of whom had formally claimed it, all of whom were watching it. Strategically useless, symbolically significant, a world that Goa'uld eyes watched, which meant whatever happened on P7J 989 would reach Anubis's intelligence network within hours. You want to demonstrate capability in a space he's already monitoring, Carter said. Smart, Ripley said. From the back of the briefing room, where she'd spent the last hour reviewing everything the SGC had on xenomorph-adjacent biology, specifically Goa'uld symbiotes, with the focused energy of someone who processed threat data the way other people processed oxygen. She'd said very little since the morning debrief, but what she said landed with the precision of someone who had learned that words, like ammunition, had finite supply and infinite consequence. Show force in a theater he's already watching. Make him do the math. Exactly, Jack said, and looked at her with the brief, warm assessment of a commanding officer recognizing a particular quality of competence. We leave in 2 hours. The team composition took 20 minutes to finalize and produce the first genuine friction of the mission. Geralt would go. This was uncontested. His abilities had registered on every SGC sensor as something categorically different from ancient, Goa'uld, or Asgard technology, and if Anubis's intelligence network had eyes on P7J 989, the readings they'd capture of a being using what Goa'uld instruments would classify as an entirely new power category would feed directly into the psychological operation Jack was constructing. Carter also wanted field readings on the signs in a Naquadah-heavy environment, and Geralt, when Daniel explained this, had shrugged with the pragmatism of a man who had spent his entire life being studied by people who found his mutations scientifically interesting. As long as I'm not in a cage, he said. No cages, Daniel said. Then fine. T'Challa would go. His own request, framed with diplomatic precision, he wanted to understand the gate network firsthand before contributing to the Infinity repair. And the vibranium suit's sensor package would gather structural data on the wormhole transit that Carter's instruments couldn't capture from this end. He did not mention that he also wanted to assess the Goa'uld threat with his own eyes rather than through briefing room summaries, but Hammond saw it and approved it for the same reason. The debate was about Ripley and Din Djarin. Ripley wanted to go. Din Djarin did not, and his objection was not about fear or uncertainty. It was about the child. Grogu could not come through the gate. The risk profile was unacceptable, and Din would not leave Grogu behind in a facility full of strangers, however well-intentioned, while he stepped through a portal to an alien world. I'll stay with him, Ripley said. Din looked at her. I've kept things alive in worse circumstances than a mountain in Colorado, she said. The flatness in her voice was not coldness. It was the specific texture of someone who had paid for that statement in a currency most people couldn't name. The child will be fine. The pause that followed was Din Djarin performing a rapid and comprehensive assessment of Ellen Ripley that was invisible behind the Beskar, but legible to anyone watching his posture. Teal'c, who had spent 20 years as First Prime learning to read people through armor, watched it happen and said nothing. If anything happens to him, Din said quietly. Nothing will happen to him, Ripley said. Another pause. Then Din unclipped the pod's secondary tether from his belt and handed it to her, a gesture that, for a Mandalorian, carried weight that no one in the room fully understood except possibly Teal'c, who had spent enough time with Din over the last 12 hours to grasp the rough outlines of what the child meant to him. Thank you, Din said. Don't thank me, Ripley said. Come back. The gate room at 1100 hours had a specific energy that every SGC veteran recognized, and none of them had ever adequately described to outsiders. The chevrons locking was a sound, each one a deep, resonant clank that built on the last, a mechanical countdown to the impossible. And the kawoosh, the unstable vortex that erupted and then resolved into the shimmering event horizon, was something you couldn't prepare a person for with words. You could tell them it would happen. You could show them footage. It didn't matter. Geralt watched the gate activate with both hands loose at his sides and the particular stillness of a man suppressing a violent reflex through sheer professional discipline. His cat pupils had blown wide at the first chevron lock, the sound hitting some frequency that his enhanced hearing processed as significant, and by the time the kawoosh erupted, he had taken half a step backward before catching himself. "First time?" Daniel said, beside him. "I have walked through portals," Geralt said, his voice level. "They did not look like that." "Nobody does," Daniel said. "You get used to it." "Do you?" Daniel considered this honestly. The first step is the worst. After that, it's remarkably fast. 1. T'Challa stood at the base of the ramp, the vibranium suit running passive scans on the event horizon. The suit's integrated systems cataloging energy outputs that Shuri would have demanded he stay behind purely to protect the data. He had sent her a mental apology for the data she would never see and stepped forward when Hammond gave the authorization. Jack went first, Teal'c behind him, Carter already recalibrating her scanner for the transit readings T'Challa had suggested. Daniel with his notebook, because Daniel always had his notebook, and Geralt had looked at this habit with the recognition of a scholar who kept field journals and said nothing. T'Challa went through without hesitation, the suit absorbing the transit energies with a faint luminescence that Carter's scanner caught and flagged for later analysis. Geralt stood at the event horizon for 1.3 seconds. The shimmering surface reflected his face back at him in fractured light, and whatever calculation he was running behind those pale eyes completed itself with the efficiency of a man who had made his peace with most things being dangerous. He stepped through. P7J989 came up blue. Not the sky. The sky was a washed amber, thick with atmospheric particulates from a volcanic event sometime in the last century that had left the upper cloud layer permanently stained. The blue was the vegetation, a low ground cover that stretched in every direction from the gate's clearing, broad-leafed and bioluminescent, even in daylight, pulsing with a rhythm that Geralt immediately identified as biological rather than mechanical. He cleared the gate, took 3 steps, and went absolutely still. "Witcher," Jack said, reading the post. "What?" "We're being watched," Geralt said. 12 o'clock, edge of the tree line. 2, no, 3. He paused. "They've been here for at least an hour. They knew we were coming." Carter checked her scanner. Nothing on biosign detection. She recalibrated. Still, nothing. She looked at Geralt, who was looking at the tree line with the flat patience of a cat watching a hole. "My instruments aren't picking anything up," she said. "Your instruments aren't smelling anything either," Geralt said. "Jaffa, they're wearing something that covers their scent, partially oil-based, probably ritual, but it doesn't cover the symbiote carrier signature. The symbiotes have a specific metabolic output." He glanced at Carter. "Like the naquata in the mountain, but biological, warmer." Teal'c stepped forward. "You can detect the presence of a symbiote through olfactory identification." His tone was not a question, but it carried the particular weight of a former First Prime confronting information that recontextualized several things simultaneously. "If you're close enough," Geralt said. "And they've been watching from that tree line long enough." T'Challa's suit had already shifted to tactical configuration, the nanotechnology redistributing density across vulnerable points with a sound like water moving through a very small space. 3 Jaffa, he said, wearing the sigil of, he paused, accessing the briefing materials he'd reviewed that morning with the photographic recall that the heart-shaped herb sharpened to an edge Baal's remnant forces. "Baal's watching this world," Jack said, not surprised, but recalibrating. "Great." He looked at the tree line with his P90 at a 45-degree angle present, not threatening, the specific angle that said, "I see you, and I'd prefer not to shoot." "Options. We could leave," Daniel offered. "We could," Jack agreed. Or we demonstrate capability in a space he's already monitoring," T'Challa said, completing the earlier logic, "for the Watchers to report back. For Anubis's network to pick up secondhand," Carter added. The three Jaffa stepped out of the tree line. They were wearing the staff and fist mark of Baal's most loyal guard caste, not conscripts but true believers, which in the post-system Lord fracturing meant something between fanatic and desperate. The foremost carried a staff weapon at full charge, the amber energy cell glowing at the head. The other two flanked him with the practiced precision of warriors who had drilled this movement so many times it had become instinct. The lead Jaffa spoke in Goa'uld. Teal'c translated without inflection. "He says we are trespassing on sacred ground, claimed by the glory of Baal, and we will surrender our weapons and submit to questioning or be destroyed." Jack looked at Geralt, then at T'Challa, then back to Jaffa. "And here's the thing," he said pleasantly, to the Jaffa, in English. "We brought some friends." What happened next took 47 seconds and was witnessed in its entirety by at least 2 additional Jaffa scouts who had been positioned in the upper canopy of the tree-line positions that Geralt had detected, but chosen not to mention, correctly anticipating that witnesses were the operational objective. T'Challa moved first. The vibranium suit absorbed the staff weapon blast from the lead Jaffa as he fired a direct hit, full charge, the kind of shot that would have ended the average SG team member, and the kinetic energy stored in the vibranium lattice redirected outward in a pulse that lifted all 3 Jaffa off their feet and deposited them very firmly on their backs in the blue-leafed ground cover, non-lethal, precise. The math of it was visible even from a distance. Geralt had moved on the flank simultaneously, not toward the downed Jaffa, toward the upper canopy where he had marked the scouts. The Ard sign, extended at combat range, produced a telekinetic shockwave that stripped the canopy leaves from the nearest trees in a circle 12 meters across, and deposited 2 more Jaffa on the ground with the efficiency of someone who had been fighting things that moved faster than Jaffa for 30 years and found the pace refreshingly manageable. The entire engagement from first staff blast to all combatants down, 47 seconds. The lead Jaffa looked up at T'Challa from the ground, then at Geralt, who was standing over the 2 canopy scouts with one sword drawn and a complete absence of urgency. Then at the end of SG-1, who had not fired a single weapon. "Tell them," Jack said to Teal'c, "that Baal may have claimed this rock, but what just happened here is going to be in every Jaffa patrol report, from here to the edge of the System Lord network. And we'd prefer he heard the accurate version." Teal'c translated. The lead Jaffa stared. "Also tell him," Jack added, almost as an afterthought, "that we have more." The implication that what he'd just seen was not exceptional capability, but routine, settled over the clearing like the amber cloud cover, pervasive, unavoidable, and very difficult to see through clearly. Geralt sheathed his sword. T'Challa stood down from tactical configuration. The 5 downed Jaffa were bound with zip ties from Carter's kit, a detail that would appear in their patrol report and strike every Goa'uld analyst who read it as inexplicably mundane and therefore deeply unsettling. "Good," Jack said. He looked at Carter. "Get your readings. We've got about 20 minutes before reinforcements, and I want those scans done before we go." Carter was already working, her scanner tracking the residual energy signatures of both the vibranium pulse and Geralt's Ard sign, with the focused hunger of someone who had just been handed 3 new chapters of physics. "This is extraordinary," she said, almost to herself. "The kinetic redirection index on the vibranium is..." "Carter." "Scanning, sir." Geralt walked to Daniel's position at the gate perimeter, cleaning his blade on the blue ground cover with the pragmatic efficiency of a man for whom this was a professional standard rather than a ritual. He looked at the bound Jaffa, then at the gate, then at the amber sky. "In my world," he said, "when you make this kind of demonstration, you need to be prepared to back it up." "Yeah," Daniel said, "that's also true in this one." "Then make sure what comes next is worth what you just promised," Geralt said. He said it without particular weight, in the tone of a witcher giving practical counsel to a client who had just made the monster's problem considerably more personal. Daniel wrote it in his notebook, because it was the kind of statement that arrived fully formed and deserved to be preserved. Above P7J 989. Invisible to ground sensors but present in the electromagnetic spectrum that Carter's long-range scanner briefly touched at the edge of its range. A cloaked observation drone bearing Anubis's mark recorded everything and began its transmission. The message it carried would reach the Hatak beyond Pluto in 6 hours. Anubis, receiving it, would sit with it for 11 minutes in the specific silence of a being who had survived long enough to understand that the most dangerous thing you could encounter was something you didn't have a category for. Then he would begin to reach for it anyway, because that was the nature of the kind of power that believed it had already seen everything. It couldn't help itself. And somewhere in the blue-lit clearing, on P7J 989, Jack O'Neill looked at the sky with the expression he reserved for plans that were working, which was an expression he tried never to let anyone see because it was, in his private assessment, the most dangerous look a commanding officer could wear. "Good," he said again quietly. "Let's go home." Ellen Ripley had kept things alive in worse places than Cheyenne Mountain. She had kept 17 people breathing for 6 days in a Wayland-Yutani processing facility with failing life support, 3 functional weapons between them, and a xenomorph queen 2 floors below who had taken the loss of her eggs as a personal matter. She had kept one little girl alive through a hive that had taken trained Colonial Marines apart like tissue paper. She understood survival not as a philosophy, but as a practice, a series of decisions made in sequence, each one buying the next 10 minutes, the decisions themselves mattering less than the discipline of making them without flinching. The SGC's lower residential corridor was, by comparison, extremely manageable. Grogu sat in his pod in the center of Ripley's assigned quarters, which she had mentally reconfigured as a perimeter the moment Din Djarin had handed her the tether. The child had been awake for 40 minutes, cataloging the room with the enormous dark eyes that Ripley had already decided were deceptive, in the specific way that very old things in very small packages tended to be deceptive. He wasn't distressed. He wasn't afraid. He was, if anything, curious, reaching small green fingers toward the air in front of him in a way that suggested he was perceiving something in the room that Ripley's instruments couldn't detect. "What are you looking at?" she asked him. Grogu turned the enormous eyes on her and made a sound that was not language in any technical sense but carried the unmistakable structure of an answer. "Fair enough," Ripley said. She had reviewed the SGC's full Goa'uld biological file in the 4 hours since the morning briefing, cross-referencing it with every xenobiological framework she had developed over 20 years of encounter documentation. The structural parallels between Goa'uld symbiote biology and xenomorph reproductive strategy were not coincidental-looking. Both exploited host biology, both operated on a suppression model, both treated human consciousness as a resource to be managed rather than a presence to be reckoned with. The difference was granularity. Xenomorphs were elegant in their brutality, pure biological imperative, no cognition beyond survival and reproduction, no cruelty because cruelty required self-awareness. The Goa'uld were worse because they were aware. They knew exactly what they were doing to their hosts. She had written 3 pages of comparative notes that she suspected Carter would find useful and set them aside for the team's return. She was on page 4 when the proximity alarm in the corridor chirped twice. Not the base-wide alert that would have been klaxons and red lighting. This was the smaller sound the one the duty SF had explained, meant motion sensor, residential corridor, low priority. Probably another SGC personnel member, probably nothing. Ripley had learned a long time ago that probably nothing was the sound that preceded most of the worst things that had ever happened to her. She was at the door in 3 steps, the pulse rifle up, when it opened to reveal Dr. Janet Fraser with a medical kit and the specific expression of a physician who had been doing this long enough that a woman pointing a very large weapon at her face produced professional assessment rather than alarm. "Warrant Officer Ripley," Fraser said calmly. "I'm Dr. Fraser. I did knock." Ripley lowered the rifle 2 inches. Fraser's eyes moved from the rifle to the pod to Ripley's face and back again with the rapid triage efficiency of a combat medic. "The child," she said. "May I?" A pause. Grogu had turned in his pod to look at Fraser with the same ancient, evaluating attention he'd turned on everything else. Then he made a sound that Ripley had begun, tentatively, to read as favorable. "He seems to think so," Ripley said, and stepped back. Janet Fraser had examined Asgard, Tokra, Jaffa, Goa'uld hosts pre- and post-extraction, human ancient hybrids, and one memorable afternoon, a being that had technically been energy but had briefly occupied a body for medical consultation purposes. She approached Grogu with the same methodology she applied to all of them: observation first, instrument second, assumption never. What she found was a being of approximately 50 years of age in a body that read as equivalent to a human infant, with a neurological profile that her instruments flagged as anomalous in 14 separate categories. A force sensitivity she had no instrument for, but could infer from the way every piece of loose equipment in the room had oriented itself slightly toward him during the examination, and a general health status she could only describe as inexplicably robust. "He's healthy," she told Ripley. "Whatever he is, he's very healthy." "He eats frogs," Ripley said. Fraser made a note. "I'll add that to the file." She looked at Grogu, who was examining her penlight with the focused attention of a scientist. "He's not afraid." "He doesn't seem to be afraid of much," Ripley said. There was something in her voice that wasn't quite wonder but was adjacent to it, the specific quality of someone who recognized courage in an unexpected form and found it affecting. "Unlike the rest of us," Fraser said, and began packing her kit. Then she stopped, set the kit down, looked at Ripley with the direct, undefended honesty that was one of Janet Fraser's most consistent professional qualities. "You should know the base has been on elevated readiness since 0600. The Hatak is still holding the position." "I know," Ripley said. "The team will be back in approximately 3 hours." "I know that too," Fraser nodded. She picked up her kit. Then, at the door, "For what it's worth, Warrant Officer, what you did with the symbiote comparative analysis." Colonel Carter called it from the field. She said it was some of the most useful cross-referenced xenobiology she'd seen. A pause. "You've done this a long time." "Too long," Ripley said. Then, "Not long enough." "Those are both true." Fraser left. Grogu watched the door close and then turned back to Ripley and made the sound she was beginning to identify as a question. "They're coming back," Ripley told him. The sound again. "All of them," she said. "That's the job." The gate activated at 1,347 hours, and SG-1 plus T'Challa and Geralt came through in the standard return order. Point first, medics met them at the ramp. Iris closed behind the last team member before the wormhole disengaged. Ripley was in the gate room observation deck with Grogu's pod before the event horizon had fully collapsed, running a visual count with the automatic efficiency of someone who had spent years counting heads in airlocks. 6 out, 6 in. She exhaled once. Didn't let anyone see it. The debrief from P7J 989 ran 90 minutes and produced the first significant intelligence development of the mission. Carter's field scans of Geralt's ARD sign and T'Challa's vibranium kinetic pulse had captured enough data to construct a preliminary energy profile that was, in Carter's assessment, something Anubis has never encountered, cannot replicate, and cannot easily model. The observation drone they'd detected briefly at the edge of scanner range confirmed the operation had been witnessed. The Jaffa Patrol report would be moving through Goa'uld intelligence networks within hours. He'll receive a report describing a ground force engagement in which 5 Jaffa were disabled non-lethally in under a minute by 2 individuals using power types his instruments can't classify, Carter said, pulling up the energy profile on the briefing room screen. He already knows from the dimensional breach that Earth has something new. Now he knows it's not just a ship, it's people. People he can't categorize, T'Challa said. Which is worse for someone like Anubis, Daniel added. He dealt with the threat of ancient knowledge by acquiring it. He dealt with the replicator threat by modeling it. Something he can't model. Makes him move faster, Geralt said. He had been watching the energy profile on the screen with the focused attention he'd given everything since arriving, not wonder, but the professional assessment of a monster hunter examining a new species' behavioral pattern. He won't wait 72 hours now. The room absorbed this. How long? Hammond asked. Geralt looked at the Hatak's position on the solar system display, the small red marker sitting beyond Pluto like a held breath. In my world, when a creature decides to stop waiting and move, it moves when it thinks your attention is divided. He looked at Jack. When are you most divided? Jack looked at Carter. Carter looked at the clock. We're scheduled for a Tokra communication window in 14 hours, she said slowly. If Anubis's intelligence network has any penetration into the Tokra, which it does, Teal'c said, Tanith proved that. Then he knows our communication schedule, Hammond said, and he'll move during it, Jack finished. Because that's when our gate is occupied and our command staff is focused on the communication room. He looked at Geralt with the expression he reserved for people who had just been useful in a way he hadn't expected. Good call. It's not a good call, Geralt said. It's just how predators think. Around here, Jack said, that's the same thing. The Tokra communication came through on schedule at 0200 hours. The long-range communication device in the SGC's sub-level relay room activating with its characteristic high-frequency harmonics that set teeth on edge if you stood too close. Jacob Carter Selmack, the Tokra symbiote, appeared in the holographic interface with the specific look of a man whose symbiote has been talking in the back of his head for the last 6 hours and has opinions. Sam Carter stood across the relay table from her father's image with the complicated expression that was specifically reserved for communications where both halves of that relationship were trying to work simultaneously. Sam, Jacob said. And then, without preamble, because Selmack had been a spy for 2,000 years and did not waste communication windows, what in the name of everything did you do? We're picking up Jaffa patrol reports from 3 separate System Lord networks. The energy signatures from P7J 989 have gone through Goa'uld intelligence like, we had some unexpected arrivals, Carter said. Unexpected, Jacob's eyes flickered, the brief tell of Selmack taking a more direct role. When he continued, his voice had the layered quality of both personalities speaking. The dimensional breach. We detected it. Every Tokra outpost within range detected it. Sam, what you opened the resonance frequency from that breach matches theoretical models in our oldest databases, pre-Goa'uld, ancient. The room went very still. The ancients modeled dimensional travel, Carter said. They did more than model it, Jacob said. They attempted it, once, approximately 40 million years ago, before the main evolution of the Stargate network. The records are fragmentary. The Tokra inherited them from a Goa'uld who'd raided an outpost, so the provenance is questionable, but the energy signature is identical. He paused. Sam, the ancient experiment didn't fail because the technology was insufficient. Carter felt the specific cold of a conclusion arriving before she was ready for it. Why did it fail? Jacob looked at her across the holographic interface with her father's eyes and something much older's knowledge. It didn't fail, he said. It was stopped. From the other side. The relay room was silent, except for the hum of the long-range communication device. Something on the other side of those dimensional membranes didn't want to be found, Jacob continued. The ancient records suggest they encountered something in the space between dimensions, the membrane space itself, that was aware. That pushed back. He leaned forward. And now you've opened 4 breaches simultaneously and pulled 4 beings through, and whatever lives in that space knows you did it. Carter looked at the relay interface for a long moment. Then she looked at the door. Through it, somewhere in the residential corridor, 4 people from 4 dimensions were sleeping or not sleeping, each carrying something of the world they'd been pulled from, each chosen, according to Jacob's account, by a universe that had noticed. I need to tell Hammond, Carter said. Sam. Jacob's voice, fully her father now, the spy and the symbiote momentarily secondary. Be careful. Anubis is the threat you can see. Whatever lives in the membrane space is the one you can't. The holographic interface dissolved. Carter stood in the relay room alone for exactly 11 seconds, doing the kind of mathematics that didn't show up on scanners, the arithmetic of cascading consequences of experiments that had seemed contained until they weren't. And then she walked quickly toward Hammond's office. Because there was a new variable in the equation, and the equation had not been manageable to begin with. Behind her, the long-range communication device registered a brief, anomalous signal on a frequency that corresponded to none of the SGC's known contacts. The signal lasted 0.4 seconds. It was not Tokra. It was not Goa'uld. It was not Asgard. The monitoring system flagged it, filed it in the automated log, and moved on to the next reading. No alarm triggered. No alert sent. But in Grogu's pod, in the residential corridor, 2 levels up, the child opened his eyes in the darkness and looked at the ceiling with the patient, ancient attention of something that had heard a frequency no instrument in the mountain was designed to detect. And outside, 80 million kilometers past Pluto, the Hatak began to move. The Tokra base, designated Gamma Site 7, existed inside a hollowed asteroid in the outer belt of the Callium system, a location chosen for its gravitational instability, which made approach vectors unpredictable enough to discourage casual surveillance. The tunnels inside were the Tokra's signature architecture, smooth-walled, amber-lit, carved by symbiote-directed crystal growth over decades into something that felt simultaneously ancient and alive. The light didn't come from the fixtures. It came from the walls themselves, bioluminescent crystal veins, pulsing with the slow rhythm of something that had grown rather than been built. T'Challa noticed the rhythm immediately. Vibranium lattice has a similar pulse under electromagnetic resonance, he told Carter, as they moved through the tunnel from the ring transport platform toward the central chamber. The crystal structure here, it's not decorative. It's load-bearing and communicative simultaneously. The Tokra grow their tunnels using symbiote biochemical signals, Carter said. The crystals respond to Naquata-based chemistry. The whole structure is essentially a nervous system, T'Challa said. Carter looked at him. Yes, exactly that. They had gated to the Callium system at 0600 hours. Hammond's response to Jacob's warning had been characteristically direct. If the Tokra had 40-million-year-old records about the dimensional membrane and what lived in it, those records needed to be in SGC hands before Anubis reached Earth orbit. The team was Carter, Daniel, Teal'c, and T'Challa. Because T'Challa had made the case for his inclusion with the quiet precision of a diplomat who understood that his presence at a negotiation table changed the negotiation. The Tokra will assess every member of this team, he had said to Hammond at the pre-mission briefing. They will ask themselves whether our new allies represent a genuine capability shift or a liability. I would prefer to answer that question in person rather than through a report. Hammond had approved it. Jack, who was staying at the SGC to oversee the Hatak approach, monitoring and coordinating with the 3 other members of the group, had looked at T'Challa with the expression he used for people who had just demonstrated they understood how the game was played. "Don't let them talk you into anything," Jack had said. "I am a king," T'Challa had replied. "I do not get talked into things." "That's what Daniel said the first time he met the Tokra," Jack said. He came back with a subcutaneous transmitter and a new appreciation for fine print. Daniel had not disputed this. Counselor Delic met them in the central chamber with the specific quality of Tokra welcome that was structurally indistinguishable from assessment. He was tall, silver-haired, with a layered vocal resonance of a host and symbiote who had been together long enough that the boundary between personalities had become more philosophical than practical. He looked at Carter with the warmth of a genuine ally. He looked at Daniel with the scholarly recognition of someone who had read his cultural reports. He looked at Teal'c with the complicated acknowledgement of a species regarding someone who had once been its enemy's most effective weapon. Then he looked at T'Challa. T'Challa looked back. The silence lasted perhaps 3 seconds and covered considerable ground. "King T'Challa," Delic said, "we have heard the Jaffa Patrol reports from P7J989. The vibranium resonance signature is remarkable. I am told the same of your tunnels," T'Challa said. "The crystal growth methodology suggests a materials science that Wakanda would find professionally interesting." Delec's expression moved in the way that Tokra expressions moved when the symbiote found something unexpected, a fractional recalibration, visible only if you knew what to look for. Daniel knew what to look for. He wrote a note. "You study materials," Delec said. "We study everything that helps us protect our people," T'Challa said. "I suspect that is something the Tokra understand." It was the right thing to say, framed in exactly the right register, acknowledging shared purpose without claiming equivalence, establishing respect without performing deference. Delec's posture shifted by approximately 2 degrees, which in Tokra diplomatic body language was the equivalent of pulling out a chair. "Come," Delec said. "The records you need are in the archive chamber, and there is something else you should see." The archive chamber was deeper in the asteroid, the tunnels narrowing, and the crystal light growing warmer as they descended. Jacob was waiting there, present physically now, having traveled from a separate Tokra outpost overnight, with the look of a man who had spent the journey reviewing what he was about to show them and finding it progressively less comfortable each time. The records were stored in the Tokra's crystalline data archive, not digital but molecular, information encoded in crystal lattice patterns that required a specialized reader to translate. The reader projected the data as holographic text and diagrams, and what it projected in the archive chamber had been in the Tokra's possession for 200 years without anyone fully understanding what they were looking at. Until now. The ancients called the space between dimensional membranes Kalach Nor, Daniel said, reading the holographic text with the accelerating focus of a linguist encountering a primary source. "The space that listens, that's the literal translation." He looked at Jacob. They weren't speaking metaphorically. "No," Jacob said. "They weren't." The diagram showed the dimensional membrane structure not as the physics model Carter had been working from, which was accurate as far as it went, but as the ancients had understood it after 40 million years of study. The membranes were not passive barriers. They had structure, pattern. The ancient records used a word that Daniel translated provisionally as intentionality, and then looked at his own translation for a long moment before writing it down because it was the right word and he wasn't sure he was ready for it to be the right word. "The ancients believed the membrane space itself was organized," he said carefully. "Not conscious in the way we use the word, not thinking, not planning, but responsive, structured in a way that suggested Something had arranged it. Something that predates the ancients, Jacob said. Carter was studying the energy diagrams with the scanner she'd brought, cross-referencing the ancient models against her own data from the Infinity's dimensional breach. The match was not approximate. It was exact. The 4 breach points, she said slowly. They didn't open randomly. The Infinity's ZPM overload provided the energy, but the locations of the breaches, the specific dimensional addresses, we were not chosen by the ZPM, T'Challa said. He had been reading the diagrams over Daniel's shoulder with the focused attention he'd brought to every technical briefing since arriving, and something in his expression had shifted, not alarm, but the particular gravity of a king recognizing the weight of information that couldn't be unknown. Something in the membrane space directed the breaches. Toward specific dimensions, Daniel said. Toward specific people. The archive chamber was quiet, except for the hum of the crystal reader and the slow pulse of the tunnel walls. The 4 of them were chosen, Carter said. That's the operative question, Jacob said. Chosen by what? And for what purpose? T'Challa straightened and looked at the holographic diagrams with the expression of someone reorganizing their understanding of their own situation from the foundation up, not panicking, because panic was a luxury he had trained himself out of, but recalibrating with the thoroughness that his father had taught him was the only appropriate response to genuinely new information. In Wakanda, he said, when we discover that an event we believed was random was in fact directed, our first question is not, what does the director want? Our first question is, what does the director know that we don't? Delic looked at him. That is a wiser first question. What does the membrane space know? Daniel said, half to himself, writing rapidly, that caused it to select a witcher, a warrant officer, a king, and a Mandalorian bounty hunter for whatever this is. Not random selections, T'Challa said. Consider, Geralt hunts things that others cannot. Ripley has survived things that should have been unsurvivable. The Mandalorian protects something that every force in his galaxy wants. And he paused. I have spent my reign learning when to open a closed country to the world and when to defend it. The silence that followed had the particular quality of several people arriving at the same implication from different directions simultaneously. Each of you represents a different answer to the same question, Daniel said slowly. Hunt, survive, protect, open. Or, Carter said, and something in her voice made everyone look at her. Each of you represents a different kind of threshold, a different relationship with a boundary, the boundary between what's known and what's unknown, between inside and outside. She looked at the dimensional membrane diagram. The Infinity breached 4 membranes. The membrane space responded by sending through 4 people whose entire lives have been defined by what happens at the threshold. The crystal reader hummed. The tunnel walls pulsed. I think, Jacob said in the voice that was entirely Selmak, 2,000 years of intelligence work distilled into one carefully weighted sentence that whatever arranged those 4-dimensional addresses is not finished arranging things. They were preparing to return to the ring transport when Delic stopped T'Challa at the tunnel entrance with the specific quality of a Tokra who has one more thing to say and has been deciding whether to say it for the duration of the meeting. There is a word in the ancient records, Delic said. One Daniel did not translate aloud. I believe he recognized it and chose to sit with it before speaking. He looked at Daniel, who had the expression of someone who had indeed been sitting with something. Progenitos, Daniel said. The ancient word sat in the amber light of the tunnel like something that had been waiting for a room to be set in. It appears 3 times in the dimensional membrane records. He looked at T'Challa, then at the tunnel, leading back toward the ring transport and the gate and Earth. It means, approximately, those who were always going to be here. T'Challa absorbed this with the stillness of a man for whom stillness was a practice rather than an absence. Not chosen, he said finally, Expected. There's a difference, Daniel said. Yes, T'Challa said. Chosen implies a chooser who could have chosen otherwise. Expected implies. He stopped. Then, it implies the membrane space has been waiting. For how long? Carter asked. Daniel looked at the crystal reader, at the 40-million-year-old records projected in amber light in a Tokra tunnel inside an asteroid in a system most humans would never visit. He looked at the word Progenitos in the holographic text, appearing 3 times in records that predated the Stargate network by millions of years. I think, he said carefully, that's a question we need to answer before Anubis reaches Earth orbit. The ring transport activated. They rose through the asteroid toward the surface, and above them the stars of the Kalium system held their positions with the indifferent patience of things that had been there long before the question was asked and would be there long after it was answered. 4 levels below the SGC gate room, in the residential corridor, Grogu sat in his open pod in the dark and looked at the wall with the ancient, patient attention of something that had heard Progenitos 40 million years before anyone had a word for it. His small hand reached toward the wall. The crystal in Carter's geological sample kit, a piece of ancient quartz she'd carried for 3 years as a reference mineral, began, very quietly, to glow. The moon of P9C 372 had no name in any Goa'uld registry, which was precisely why Teal had suggested it. It existed in the administrative gap between 3 System Lord territories, a gravitational afterthought, tidally locked to a gas giant that nobody had bothered to claim because it had no Naquadah deposits. No strategic gate position, no population to enslave. It was, in the language of galactic politics, a nothing place. And nothing places, Teal'c had learned in 20 years of serving false gods and then fighting them, were where the real conversations happened, the ones that didn't appear in mission reports, the ones that mattered most. He had suggested it to Din Djarin at 0400 hours, standing in the SGC corridor outside the residential quarters, both of them awake for reasons neither had articulated, but both understood. The Hatak was moving. The rest of the team was off-world gathering intelligence, and 2 warriors, with nothing actionable to do with their hands, were not, in practice, men who slept. There's a Jaffa contact, Teal'c had said. Free Jaffa. A warrior named Bratac, who was my teacher and is now my brother, in the only way that word means anything. He had looked at Din Djarin with the directness that was his primary mode of communication. He has been tracking Anubis's fleet movements from inside the Free Jaffa network. He will have information we do not have. But he will not come to the SGC, and he will not communicate through channels Anubis might monitor. A pause. He will meet me on P9C 372. He has met me there before. A pause. A pause. Din Djarin had looked at him for a long moment. You're telling me this because you want me to come. I am telling you this, Teal said, because I believe you should. The reason behind the belief had not been stated. It didn't need to be. Din had read it in the economy of the offer. Teal'c was not a man who extended invitations carelessly, and the specific invitation to accompany him to meet his oldest living mentor was not casual. It was, in the vocabulary of warriors who expressed regard through action rather than declaration, significant. Hammond authorized? Din asked. General Hammond has authorized a reconnaissance gate mission to P9C 372, Teal said. The team composition is at my discretion. Din had picked up his helmet from the chair beside his bunk. Let's go. P9C 372's moon was cold, the way empty places were cold, not dramatically, not with wind or ice, just the fundamental chill of a place that the sun touched briefly and then moved on from. The gate sat in a shallow crater, surrounded by gray-brown rock that stretched to a horizon so flat it looked manufactured. The gas giant hung overhead, enormous and amber-banded, casting everything in a light that was almost warm, but not quite. Bratac was already there. He was shorter than Din had expected from Teal's description, not small, but compact, in the way of something that had been refined by decades of pressure into its essential form. He wore the robes of a free Jaffa elder over the posture of a man who had been a warrior first for so long that the posture had become structural. He was at least 100 years old. He moved like 40. He looked at Teal'c with the expression of a teacher seeing a student who had, against considerable odds, continued to not disappoint him. Then he looked at Din Djarin with the particular assessment of a man who had spent a century reading warriors and was doing so now automatically, the way other people breathed. "This is the one from beyond the membrane," Bratac said. It was not a question. "This is Din Djarin," Teal'c said. "He is Mandalorian." Bratac looked at the Beskar with the recognition of a weapons expert encountering an unfamiliar alloy and identifying its quality in under 3 seconds. "The armor is exceptional," he said. Then, directly to Din, "You have carried the child through war." "Yes," Din said, "and you would do so again." "Yes." Bratac nodded, once the sharp, complete nod of someone closing a question. "Then we understand each other," he said, and turned to the business that had brought them here, because Bratac was a man who moved from assessment to action with the minimum of ceremony that the situation required, and not one word more. The intelligence Bratac carried was specific and cold. Anubis had not merely moved his Hatak toward Earth, he had moved 3. 2 were still cloaked at the edge of the solar system, positioned at triangulated points around Earth's orbital path, not an assault formation, but a containment formation. The visible Hatak was the one Anubis wanted the SGC watching. The 2 cloaked ones were the ones he was actually planning around. "He intends to allow the SGC to respond to the visible ship," Bratac said. "Commit resources to its approach. When Earth's defense is oriented toward the visible threat, the cloaked Hatak will move on the moon of," he paused. "He calls it the facility where the membrane opened. He does not know it is the SGC specifically. He knows only that the dimensional breach originated from a facility on the 3rd planet's surface. He's going to try to capture the infinity," Teal'c said. "He is going to try to capture the technology," Bratac corrected. "The infinity is the vessel. What he wants is the 0-point module and whatever drove the dimensional breach. He believes that with the ZPM and the breach data, he can replicate the event under controlled conditions and pull through whatever he wants from whatever dimension he chooses," Din said. The 3 of them sat with that for a moment. "An army," Din said. It was not speculative. It was the operational conclusion of a man who had spent his life in the shadow of powers that collected force the way other things collected resources. He wants to build an army from dimensions he can raid at will. "Anubis has always wanted what he does not have," Bratac said. "He has ancient knowledge. He has Jaffa armies. He has technology that most system lords cannot match. And still, he reaches further." The old warrior's expression carried the specific weight of someone who had watched ambition destroy more things than war. It is the nature of the half-ascended. They are caught between 2 states of existence. They cannot let go of power because they are not fully on the higher plane. They cannot transcend because they will not release the lower one. "Die, trapped," Din said. "Hungry," Bratac said. "Which is worse?" Teal'c looked at the gas giant hanging overhead. "We must return with this intelligence. General Hammond will need to reorient Earth's defense posture before the cloaked Hatak move." "There is one more thing," Bratac said. He produced a data crystal Goa'uld manufacture, the kind used for intelligence transfers, small enough to conceal in a closed fist. He held it for a moment without extending it. in the way of someone who has carried something difficult long enough to have formed an opinion about passing it on. My intelligence contact within Anubis's network sent this 3 days ago, he said. Before the dimensional breach, before any of this began. He looked at Teal'c. The timing is not coincidental. Teal'c took the crystal. What does it contain? A name, Bratac said. In ancient. My contact found it in Anubis's personal research, files a project he has been running for 11 years, separate from his military operations. Funded from resources no other system Lord knows about. He paused. The project is called Progenitos. The moon was silent. Din Djarin looked at Teal'c. Teal'c looked at the data crystal with the expression of a man whose understanding of the situation had just been restructured from the ground up. He already knew, Teal'c said. He has been preparing. Bratac confirmed. Whatever the membrane space is, whatever it is intended by sending 4 beings through Anubis, learned of it through the ancient knowledge he carries. And he has been building something in response for 11 years. The old warrior looked at both of them with the eyes of a man who had survived a century of impossible situations by never underestimating the thing he was and facing. He is not reacting to the dimensional breach. He was waiting for it. They returned through the gate at 1,100 hours and went directly to Hammond's office, bypassing the standard debrief protocol with the authorization that came from carrying intelligence that could not wait for paperwork. Jack was already in the office. Carter had returned from the Tokra base 20 minutes earlier and was at the whiteboard, an actual whiteboard, because sometimes the enormity of a problem required the physical act of writing it out with 3 columns of information that had been growing since her return and had now reached the point where they were bleeding into each other. At the margins, Din placed the data crystal on Hammond's desk. Teal'c delivered the intelligence in the precise, economical style that 20 years of military reporting had made second nature. 3 Hatak, 2 cloaked, containment formation. Objective the Infinity and its ZPM, Project Progenitos, 11 years of preparation. Anubis was not reacting, but executing. The room absorbed this in the specific silence of people recalibrating simultaneously. He knew they were coming, Jack said. Not a question, not quite disbelief. The tone of a special forces officer absorbing a tactical development and already moving past the shock of it toward what it meant operationally. He knew the 4 of them were going to come through. He's been building something to use them, or to use what they represent, Carter said. She had turned from the whiteboard, and her expression was the one she wore when multiple streams of data had converged into something she hadn't wanted them to converge into. The Tokra records called them Progenitos, those who were always going to be here. Anubis has the same word in his research files. He's read the same ancient records the Tokra have, and he's had 11 years to think about what to do when they arrived, Daniel said. The whiteboard had 3 columns: membrane space intent, Anubis intent, SGC, position. The 3rd column was the shortest. What is he building? Hammond asked. Carter looked at the data crystal. We'll need to analyze the full contents. But based on the Tokra records, the ancient research on dimensional membrane structure, and Anubis's known capability set. She paused in the way she paused when the answer was something she'd rather not say. I think he's building a containment system, something designed to trap beings from other dimensions and extract what they carry. Extract what? Jack said. Whatever the membrane space sent them here with, Carter said. Whatever Progenitos means in practice. If the membrane space chose 4 people defined by their relationship to thresholds to boundaries, then what they carry isn't just ability or skill. It's something more fundamental. She looked at the whiteboard. Anubis doesn't want their powers. He wants what makes them Progenitos. He wants whatever the membrane space gave them when he chose them. Din Djarin had been standing at the back of the office with the stillness he carried like a second layer of armor. You're saying he wants to take something from them? Yes, Carter said. From all 4. That's what the 11-year project suggests. Din looked at the data crystal on Hammond's desk, then at Teal'c, then at the door, beyond which Geralt and Ripley were in the training room, a development that had begun as a weapons assessment and had apparently evolved into something considerably more complex involving a silver sword, a pulse rifle, and what the observing SF had described in his report as mutual professional respect expressed through aggressive sparring. "Then we don't give him the chance," Din said. "Easier said," Jack started. "Everything worth doing is easier said," Din replied. It was not combative. It was the flat, factual tone of a man who had operated under impossibly difficult constraints his entire professional life and had made his peace with the gap between what was easy to say and what was hard to do. "That doesn't change what needs to be done." Teal'c looked at his oldest friend and teacher's data crystal on Hammond's desk, and then at the man from another dimension standing in a Colorado mountain office, speaking the same operational philosophy that Bratac had taught him in a different language 30 years ago. "Indeed," Teal'c said. It was the first time he had said it since the 4 arrivals had come through the infinity. It landed in the room with the quiet weight of recognition of 2 warriors from 2 entirely different galaxies arriving, through completely different paths, at the same fundamental understanding of what duty required. Hammond picked up the data crystal. "Get everyone into the briefing room. All of them." He looked at Jack. "We have 2 cloaked hot talk we didn't know about this morning, and 11 years of Anubis preparation we didn't know about yesterday." He stood, which meant the moment of absorbing the intelligence was over and the moment of acting on it had begun. "I want a defense plan on this table in 2 hours. Through the briefing room window, the Stargate stood in its gate room, below silent, dormant, a ring of alien metal connecting 10,000 worlds, built by beings who had ascended beyond the need for it and left it running for everyone else to use and fight over and die beside. Somewhere inside P9C 372's moon, Bratac was already moving back through his network, back to the Free Jaffa contacts that stretched across the System Lord remnants like roots under stone, pulling information toward the surface for the people who needed it. And in the membrane space between dimensions in Kalach Nor, the space that listens something that predated the ancients by an interval too large for numbers to carry, registered the movement of Anubis's fleet and the gathering of the Progenitos in a mountain on a small blue world, and held itself in the patient architecture of something that has arranged for exactly this and is now simply waiting to see if the arrangement holds. The briefing room at 1300 hours had the specific atmosphere of a room in which everyone present understood that the next conversation would determine the shape of everything that followed. Hammond had seen that atmosphere before the first Apophis attack, before the replicator incursion, before the Ori's first prior walked through a gate and smiled. It had a texture to it, like the air before a storm that had already decided to arrive. All 8 of them were present. SG-1 on one side. The 4 arrivals on the other, which was the seating arrangement they had defaulted to since the first briefing, and which Hammond had noticed was slowly, session by session, becoming less pronounced chairs angling toward each other. The invisible line between us and them dissolving at its edges the way all such lines did when people had been through enough together to stop measuring the distance. Carter had the whiteboard. The 3 columns had expanded to 5. "Here's what we know," she said, and the room went quiet with a quality of quiet that meant everyone was already thinking 3 steps ahead of what she was about to say. "Anubis has 3 Hatak in the solar system, 1 visible, 2 cloaked, triangulated positions around Earth's orbital path. His objective is the infinity, and specifically the ZPM dimensional breach technology. He's been preparing for this for 11 years under the project name Progenitos, the same word the ancients used for our 4 arrivals in the dimensional membrane records." She paused. "He is not improvising. He has a plan. We are currently inside it." "What's the plan?" Geralt asked. He had his arms crossed. and the expression of a monster hunter who had just learned the monster had been tracking him, rather than the other way around, which was an expression that contained approximately equal parts recalibrated respect and cold professional anger. Based on the data crystal Teal'c retrieved from Bratac, combined with the Tokra records and what I know of Anubis's technology profile, Carter brought up the holographic display above the briefing table. The 3 Hatak positions rendered in blue against a solar system schematic. He's going to use the visible Hatak as a forcing mechanism. Force us to commit our gate-based response assets to the visible threat. Meanwhile, the 2 cloaked Hatak will execute a precision strike on the surface facility, not a bombardment, because he doesn't want to destroy the ZPM, a targeted extraction. Jaffa ground teams through ring transport simultaneously with an orbital suppression of our gate activity to prevent us calling for help. He rings troops directly into the mountain, Jack said, through the same energy signature the Infinity used to breach the dimensional membrane, Carter said. He's reverse-engineered enough of the breach frequency to use it as a targeting solution. He can punch ring transport through our iris. The room absorbed that. He can bypass the iris, Ripley said. Yes. So your primary base defense is gone? Yes. Ripley looked at the solar system schematic with the flat, unsentimental attention of someone performing threat mathematics. How long between the visible Hatak committing to its approach and the cloaked ships moving on the surface? Based on the containment formation geometry, Carter did the calculation in real time, her fingers moving on the holographic display. Approximately 11 minutes. He waits for us to gate our response teams out, orient our F-302S to the visible ship. Then the cloaked ships move. 11 minutes from us committing our assets to the surface teams arriving. 11 minutes, Dinjarin said. 11 minutes, Carter confirmed. Din looked at the schematic. Then at his helmet on the table in front of him, visor up, Beskar caught the briefing room light in a way that made it look like something that had survived more than it had any right to. In 11 minutes, he said, a lot can happen. Or not happen, Geralt said, and Din glanced at him with the brief recognition of 2 people arriving at the same tactical assessment from different angles. Hammond looked at both of them. I'm listening, he said. The plan that emerged over the next 90 minutes was built on a principle that Jack articulated in the characteristically oblique way he articulated most things that were actually precise. We give Anubis exactly what he's expecting, right up until the moment we don't. The visible Hatak would receive a conventional SGC response, F-302S, scrambled. Gate teams stood by. Prometheus, on standby alert. Exactly what Anubis's model predicted. Exactly what would confirm to his intelligence network that Earth was responding as anticipated and the surface extraction window was open. What Anubis's model did not contain was 8 people who had been in the same building for 36 hours and had, in that time, developed the specific operational chemistry that forms between competent people under pressure, not friendship exactly, not yet, but the functional intimacy of shared stakes and mutual recognition of capability. The defense of the SGC would not be conventional. The ring transport targeting uses the breach frequency as a lock-on, Carter said. If we can introduce interference in that frequency specifically, the energy signature of the 4 arrivals themselves, which is what the breach was originally attracted to, we can corrupt the targeting solution. You want to use us as jamming signals, T'Challa said. Your energy signatures are literally what opened the dimensional membrane, Carter said. To Anubis's targeting system, you 4 are the source. If you're distributed at 4 points around the mountain when his ring transport locks on, the signal splits, T'Challa said. 4 lock-ons instead of 1. The rings can't resolve to a single transport point. It won't stop the rings permanently, Carter said. Maybe 4 minutes of confusion before his operators recalibrate manually. But 4 minutes changes the arithmetic, Ripley said. Significantly, Carter confirmed. Geralt had been looking at the mountain schematic, the SGC's internal layout, projected in cross-section, showing the gate room, the residential corridor, the vehicle bay where the Infinity sat, the sublevels that extended deep into Cheyenne Mountain's granite core. He had been looking at it for 3 minutes, with the specific quality of attention that Daniel had learned to recognize as Geralt performing a battlefield assessment not of the enemy's approach, but of the terrain itself. Because witches fought smart, or they didn't survive to fight again. The vehicle bay, Geralt said. What about it? Jack said. The Infinity is there. The ZPM is there. That's what he wants. Geralt looked up from the schematic. Every predator, when it commits to a target, narrows its attention. The moment his ring teams lock on the Infinity, everything else in the mountain becomes secondary. He paused. That's the moment. The moment for what? Jack said. Geralt looked at him with the pale, direct attention of a man for whom the gap between identifying a tactical opportunity and using it had been trained down to nothing. For everything else in the mountain to stop being secondary. Jack looked at him for a moment, then at Teal'c, who had the expression he wore when someone had just said something Bratac would have approved of. Then back at Geralt. I really want you to explain that in more detail, Jack said. The 4 of us split to the frequency distribution points Carter identified, Geralt said. We corrupt his ring targeting. In the confusion window, the 4 minutes his ground teams arrive, disoriented, at wrong positions, with no tactical cohesion. In a mountain they don't know, against defenders they haven't modeled. He looked at Ripley. You fought in environments where the enemy had superior numbers and superior technology. Several times, Ripley said. How did you win? Environment. Ripley said immediately. You make the terrain work for you. Corridors, choke points, limited sight lines. Superior numbers stop mattering when you can only fight 3 at a time. This mountain has corridors and choke points, Geralt said. Cheyenne Mountain, Jack said slowly, is the most heavily choke-pointed military facility on Earth. A pause. I've never thought about it that way. Because you've always defended it from the outside in, Din Djarin said. Iris, gate room, surface perimeter. You've never had to defend it from the inside out. Jack looked at Din, then at Geralt, then at Ripley and T'Challa. The expression on his face was the one Carter had seen exactly 4 times in their years together, the expression of a commanding officer recognizing that the people in the room were smarter than the plan he'd walked in with. Okay, Jack said, let's build it. What they built over the remaining hour of the briefing was not elegant. Elegant plans, Jack had learned over 30 years of special operations, were plans that assumed compliance from the universe. And the universe had never once complied. What they built was layered multiple redundancies, multiple contingencies, roles assigned based on honest assessment of individual capability rather than rank or familiarity. Teal'c and Din Djarin would take the lower levels. The sub-basement corridors where the ring transport was most likely to resolve if the targeting confusion dropped a Jaffa team anywhere near the original facility center of mass. Teal'c, with his staff weapon and the institutional knowledge of Jaffa tactical doctrine. Din with Beskar that staff weapons could not penetrate, and a combat efficiency in enclosed spaces that his entire career had been built around. Jaffa in close quarters. Teal'c said to Din, as they reviewed the sub-level schematic together, rely on the staff weapon's intimidation value. The blast radius discourages engagement inside optimal range. They want you to stay back, Din said. Yes, they are trained for overwhelming force, not for an opponent who closes the distance. Din looked at the corridor widths on the schematic. I looked at his jetpack. Then at the ceiling heights. Can your staff weapon fire around corners? Teal'c looked at him. It cannot. Mine can, Din said, and showed Teal'c the whistling birds, the wrist-mounted micro-rockets that had solved many problems in many corridors across many years of bounty work. Teal'c examined them with the focused professional interest of a warrior encountering a new weapons system and rapidly calculating its tactical applications. Effective at this corridor width, Teal'c said. Very, Din confirmed. Ripley would take the vehicle bay. Not to defend the Infinity was the bait, the thing Anubis wanted, and defending it directly would be defending the wrong objective. She would take the vehicle bay to control the approach to it. Every entry point mapped, every sightline identified. Pulse rifle positioned at the choke point that made the bay a kill zone for anyone moving toward the ship without knowing she was there. She had done more with less. She had the schematics memorized before Carter had finished projecting them. T'Challa would be mobile the vibranium suit's kinetic absorption, making him the team's best option for intercepting ring transport arrivals at multiple points, absorbing the initial disorientation burst of any Jaffa team that materialized, and redirecting them into the building's geometry before they could establish tactical cohesion. He would also maintain the frequency distribution point at the mountain's north quadrant, the suit's energy signature, providing one of the 4 jamming nodes Carter needed. Geralt would take the gate room. The gate room? Jack said. It's the center, Geralt said. Everything in this mountain is oriented toward it. If his ground teams achieve any objective, they'll move toward the gate to establish an extraction point. He looked at the gate room cross-section on the schematic. It's also the highest position in the facility, with clear sight lines to 4 entry corridors simultaneously. He paused. And the Stargate itself is a source of significant energy. The kind of energy that interferes with, he looked at Carter. Sensor readings, Carter said, catching it immediately. Jaffa life sign detectors will be saturated by the gate's ambient energy in the gate room. They won't be able to track him there. They'll be fighting something they can't find in a room they can't scan, Geralt said. In my experience, that's when things that are hunting you start making mistakes. Jack O'Neill looked at Geralt of Rivia for a moment with the expression of a 30-year Special Forces veteran recognizing a 30-year monster hunter and finding the overlap more extensive than expected. Yeah, Jack said. That's when they make mistakes. The plan was set. Positions assigned. 2 hours to Anubis's projected move window based on the fleet trajectory Bratac's intelligence had provided. Hammond stood at the head of the table. He looked at all 8 of them, his team, which was also not his team, which was also 4 people who had been in this mountain for less than 2 days and were preparing to defend it like they'd been here for years, with the expression of a general who had sent good people into impossible situations enough times to know the difference between a team that was going through the motions and a team that had found its center of gravity. I don't need to tell any of you what's at stake, Hammond said. You know. He paused. What I will say is this. Whatever brought you here, whatever the membrane space intended, whatever Anubis planned for, whatever the ancients expected, you are here now. And right now, here is what matters. He looked at each of them in turn. This mountain is Earth's first line of defense against everything that wants to walk through that gate uninvited. Today, it's your mountain too. The room was quiet for a moment. Then Geralt uncrossed his arms, which was the closest thing to a formal acknowledgement his body language offered. Ripley clicked her pulse rifle to active charge with the quiet efficiency of someone who had already decided. T'Challa inclined his head with the gravity of a king accepting a covenant. Din Djarin put his helmet on, and the Beskar face closed over his expression with a finality that was itself a statement. 2 hours, Jack said. Get your positions. Eat something if you can. He stood, which meant the briefing was over and the thing itself had begun. And for the love of everything, don't blow up my mountain. Our mountain, Geralt said, quietly, already moving toward the door. Jack stopped, turned, looked at the Witcher's back as he walked out. Yeah, he said, to no one in particular. Our mountain. The 2 hours passed, the way time always passed, before a fight too fast, in the parts where there was still something useful to do, and then, suddenly, completely still, in the parts where the doing was finished and only the waiting remained. At 1 asteroid hours, Carter's long-range sensors confirmed the visible Hatak had adjusted its trajectory, no longer holding, no longer a watching posture, but committed now to an approach vector that would bring it into Earth's inner solar system within 40 minutes. The move was deliberate, choreographed. Anubis was turning the key in the lock he'd been cutting for 11 years. "He's moving," Carter said, from the monitoring station she'd established in the sub-level relay room where she could track all 3 Hatak simultaneously and feed positional data to the team through earpiece comms. "Visible ship has committed to approach." Cloaked ships. A pause, the kind that meant instruments were working at the edge of their capability, still holding. But the power signature on both just shifted. They're warming up ring transport systems. "How long?" Jack's voice through the comm, from the F-302 bay, where he was coordinating the conventional response, the misdirection, the expected moves that would confirm to Anubis's watchers that Earth was responding exactly as predicted. "Ring transport activation to surface arrival, at their current orbital position approximately 9 minutes once they commit," Carter said. "We'll see the power spike 30 seconds before transport initiates." "Copy," Jack said. "Prometheus is holding at standby. F-302s are hot. We look exactly like a base that's about to make a very predictable mistake." "Sir," Carter said. "Carter, be careful up there." A pause. "Always am." They both knew this was not strictly true, but it was the right thing to say, and they had been saying the right things to each other across impossible situations for long enough that the ritual of it had its own kind of weight. The gate room was quiet. Geralt stood at the upper level, railing the observation tier above the gate floor where the control room window looked down and looked at the Stargate with the attention he gave to things he was trying to understand before he had to operate around them. He had been standing here for 20 minutes. The SFs, who had been at their standard positions, had been redirected to the mountain's outer perimeter as part of the conventional response theater, leaving the gate room with the particular emptiness of a space designed for many people that currently held one. The Stargate hummed, not audibly, or not entirely audibly. It was below the threshold of hearing for most humans, but Geralt's enhanced senses caught it as a bone-deep resonance, a frequency that the mountain's granite walls transmitted upward from the gate room floor in a vibration that felt less like sound and more like the mountain breathing. He had stood near ley lines in his world that felt like this points where the Earth's chaos energy concentrated, where the membrane between states of being grew thin. He understood, standing in this room, why the ancients had built these things and why everything in this galaxy was organized around them. "A threshold," Carter had said, describing what the 4 of them represented, a relationship with the boundary between inside and outside. The Stargate was the largest threshold in the galaxy. He wondered if that was a coincidence. He had stopped believing in coincidence approximately 2 decades into his professional life, and nothing about the last 48 hours had suggested he should start again. He drew his silver blade, held it in the gate room light, watching the ambient energy of the Stargate move across the metal in patterns that looked almost like the luminescence of the Tokra tunnels, almost like the bioluminescence of P7J 989's ground cover, almost like the crystal in Carter's sample kit when Grogu had reached toward the wall, almost like something that recognized something. He sheathed it, took his position at the upper railing with both blades accessible, his back to the wall, sight lines open to all 4 gate room entry corridors simultaneously, the Stargate's energy saturation wrapping the room in the electromagnetic noise that would blind Jaffa sensors. He waited. In the vehicle bay, Ripley had spent her preparation time the way she spent all preparation time, making the environment work for her. The Infinity sat in the center of the bay, its hybrid hull showing the scars of the dimensional breach and the crash-landing stress fractures in the Teltac outer plating The ZPM housing slightly misaligned. Carter's repair work, visible as new welds and rerouted power conduits running across the ship's surface like sutures. It was, objectively, a damaged vessel. To Anubis's extraction team, it would read as a prize the source of the dimensional breach, the technology he'd been preparing to acquire for 11 years, sitting in a room they could reach by ring transport. Ripley had identified 4 approach vectors to the Infinity from the bay's entry points. She had established a primary position at the northwest choke point, a maintenance alcove behind a structural support pillar that gave her a clear angle to the Infinity's portside access hatch, while keeping her completely invisible to anyone entering from the main bay doors. She had established 2 secondary positions and mentally timed the movement between them. She had checked the pulse rifle's charge 3 times, not because she doubted it, but because checking was the discipline, and the discipline was what kept you alive when everything else became chaos. She had also, in the 15 minutes before taking her position, spent time with Grogu. The child was in his pod in the residential corridor locked, the corridor's security door sealed, an SF she trusted stationed at the junction with instructions that were simple and absolute. But she had gone to him before taking her position, because some things needed to be done before a fight, and this was one of them. Grogu had looked at her with enormous, dark eyes. The ancient, patient attention. "I'm going to do my job," she told him. "You stay here. Stay quiet. And when Din comes back," she had stopped. Looked at the child, who was listening with the quality of something that understood considerably more than it could express. "When Din comes back," she said again, more quietly, "you tell him I said he better not have put a scratch on that armor." Grogu had made the sound she'd learned to read as laughter, or the nearest thing to it in whatever language he used, and reached one small green hand toward her face. She had let him because she was a practical woman who had learned to accept comfort in whatever form the universe offered it, and the universe, in her experience, offered it rarely enough that refusing it was a luxury she couldn't afford. She took her position in the maintenance alcove and went still. Teal'c and Din Djarin were in the sub-basement at Corridor Junction 7, a T-intersection where 3 approaches merged into a single passage leading to the mountain's central ring transport receiver pad, the point Carter had identified as the most likely manual recalibration target if the frequency jamming knocked Anubis's teams off their primary coordinates. They stood in the junction with the easy, practiced stillness of 2 warriors who had each spent years waiting in dark places for things to arrive. The corridor was 3 meters wide and low-ceilinged, emergency lighting giving everything a flat red-orange color that turned shadows into geometry. Teal'c had said, perhaps 10 minutes into the wait, "In my years as First Prime, I waited in positions such as this many times. Before the battle, one's mind is loud," Din said. "Yes," Teal'c said, loud. A pause. "How do you quiet it?" Din was quiet for a moment. "The creed," he said finally. "The way. When everything else is uncertain, the certainty of what you are and what you're committed to." He stopped. "It's not silence. It's just something louder than the noise." Teal'c considered this with the gravity he brought to all things worth considering. "The Jaffa have a word," he said. "Kel Makta. It means, approximately, the self that remains when the battle has stripped everything else. Bratac taught me that the goal of a warrior's training is not to build that self, but to reveal it. Everything the training does is removal, removing what is not essential until only what is remains." Din looked at him. "That's the Mandalorian concept of the Forge," he said. "In our tradition, a warrior is not made. They are revealed by trials, by loss, by choice." "Perhaps," Teal'c said, "your traditions and mine came from the same source." Din looked at the red-orange shadows of the corridor for a moment. "Or arrived at the same place from different directions," he said. "That is the nature of truth," Teal'c said. "It does not require a common origin, only a common recognition." The comm in both their earpieces crackled simultaneously. Power spike on both cloaked Hatak, Carter's voice, flat and precise, and carrying the controlled urgency of someone delivering information that has moved from prediction to reality. Ring transport initiating. You have 30 seconds. Positions. Teal'c raised his staff weapon. Din dropped his visor. The Beskar caught the red-orange emergency light and held it. 30 seconds, Din said. Indeed, Teal'c said. T'Challa felt the ring transport initiation before Carter's warning reached his earpiece. The vibranium suit's sensor array had been calibrated over the last hour to detect the specific Naquadah-based energy frequency of Goa'uld ring transport systems, Carter's work, done in a 40-minute collaboration that had left both of them with 3 pages of notes and a shared sense that the intersection of vibranium nanotechnology and Stargate physics was a field of study that could occupy the better part of a decade. He was at the mountain's north quadrant, the suit broadcasting his dimensional frequency signature as one of 4 jamming nodes in Carter's targeting disruption array. He felt the ring transport energy hit the array and scatter the frequency, splitting across 4 lock-on signatures simultaneously. The Goa'uld targeting system stalling as it tried to resolve 4 sources into 1 transport coordinate and found the mathematics unresolvable. 4 minutes of confusion. Jaffa teams materializing in wrong positions, disoriented, no tactical cohesion. He was already moving before the first ring transport was completed. The vibranium suit shifted to full tactical configuration as he ran nanotechnology redistributing across vulnerable points, kinetic absorption protocols at maximum, the suit reading the mountain's internal geography from the schematic he'd memorized and plotting intercept vectors to the 3 most probable materialization points. He had identified, in his 2 hours of preparation, a tactical principle that Carter's defense plan had not fully accounted for. The most dangerous moment for a disoriented ground team was not the first 10 seconds after materialization, when they were still reorienting, but the next 30, when they recovered and began looking for each other. An isolated Jaffa was a manageable threat. A reformed Jaffa squad was a different problem entirely. The objective was not to fight them. The objective was to prevent them from finding each other. The first ring transport was resolved in the secondary equipment corridor on level 3, 40 meters north of the intended target. Exactly the kind of positional error a split targeting lock would produce. 4 Jaffa materialized in a cluster of confused energy shimmer, staff weapons active but pointing at walls, the specific disorientation of warriors whose transport had deposited them in empty corridors instead of open vehicle bay. T'Challa hit the first 2 before they finished reorienting, the kinetic pulse from the suit's stored energy scattering all 4 against the corridor walls with the non-lethal precision he'd calibrated on P7J 989's Jaffa. He was through the corridor and moving to the next intercept point before the 4 of them had started getting up. The mountain's corridors did the rest. 4 meters wide, 90-degree turns every 30 meters, every intersection looking identical to the last. Without sensor resolution, and the gate room's energy saturation was bleeding into the adjacent levels, fogging everything the Jaffa teams were navigating by memory in a building they'd never been in a disoriented scatter that T'Challa was actively making worse with each intercept. Through his earpiece, the sounds of the mountain's defense, the crack of Teal'c's staff weapon from the sub-basement, the compressed burst of Din's whistling birds in the narrow corridors, the percussion of the pulse rifle from the vehicle bay that meant Ripley had acquired a target, and from the gate room, nothing. Silence. Which was, from a Witcher, operating in an energy-saturated room against enemies who couldn't find him, exactly what it should sound like. Teams are scattered, Carter's voice in his earpiece, tracking the Jaffa life sign readings on the grid she'd established. I count 11 materialization events across 9 different positions, none in the vehicle bay, none in the gate room. The targeting disruption worked. A pause. We're at 2 minutes 40 seconds in the confusion window. They're starting to regroup. T'Challa rounded a corner and stopped. 3 Jaffa, standing at a corridor junction, had found each other. They were orienting, sharing information in the rapid Goa'uld that he'd been briefed on but didn't speak, their body language shifting from disoriented to purposeful. One was pointing toward the ramp that led upward toward the gate room, toward the infinity, toward the operational objectives their training would be pulling them to, regardless of where their transport had deposited them. T'Challa stepped into the junction. The three Jaffa looked at him. He looked at them. "I will give you the opportunity to stand down," he said, because he was a king, and kings, his father had taught him, extended that offer even when they knew the answer. Because the offer was not for the enemy, it was for yourself. It was how you remembered what you were defending. The three Jaffa raised their staff weapons. T'Challa absorbed the three blasts simultaneously, the vibranium lattice drinking the energy with a sound like a bell struck underwater, and released it in a single redirected pulse that cleared the junction in 0.8 seconds. "3 down, level 2 junction north," he said into the comm, moving to the next intercept. "Copy," Carter said. "The gate room is still clear." Geralt. A pause. "Geralt, I'm showing a 6-man team that's navigated to the level 1 approach corridor, 60 seconds from your position." In the gate room, there was still silence. Then, very quietly, the sound of 2 sword blades being drawn, and the Stargate hummed its ancient frequency into the granite walls of Cheyenne Mountain, and the mountain held its breath. And somewhere, in Kalak Nor, the space that listens, the space that had been waiting 40 million years, for exactly this convergence, of exactly these people, in exactly this place, something that had no name in any language, settled into the particular stillness of a thing that is base, watching its arrangement fulfill itself, one corridor, one junction, one threshold at a time. The 6-man Jaffa team entered the gate room from the level 1 approach corridor at 1,547 hours, moving in the staggered formation of warriors who had trained for hostile entry and were executing that training despite the disorientation of the failed ring transport staff weapons forward. The lead Jaffa, carrying a Goa'uld life sign detector that was, as Carter had predicted, completely saturated by the Stargate's ambient energy output, reading the room as a wall of interference that told him nothing useful. He moved anyway, because Jaffa were trained to move through uncertainty, and because the mission objective was visible from the gate room floor, the upper-level railing, the control room beyond it. The approach to the vehicle bay ramp that their training told them led toward the technology they'd been sent to retrieve. The gate room appeared empty. The first Jaffa made it 8 steps from the corridor entrance before the Igni sign hit the staff weapon in his hands. Not Jaffa, the weapon. Geralt had spent 20 minutes before taking his position thinking about what he knew of the Goa'uld technology from Carter's briefings and the simple, consistent fact that staff weapons were energy cell devices, and energy cell devices, in his experience of things that ran on contained power, did not respond well to a precisely targeted burst of controlled heat applied directly to the cell housing. The staff weapon's energy cell detonated with a crack that was considerably louder than Geralt had been expecting, which he filed for later. The Jaffa holding it went down hard, stunned by his own weapon's discharge. The 5 behind him scattered to the walls, good training, proper response, which was exactly what Geralt had anticipated, because scattering to the walls of the gate room meant scattering into the shadows below the upper railing, where the Stargate's energy saturation was densest and their detector was most blind. He was off the railing before the second Jaffa had completed his scatter, dropping the 12 feet to the gate room floor in the controlled fall that his enhanced physiology made routine, and a human would have broken an ankle attempting. He landed in the center of the room, between the Stargate's event horizon glow and the scattered Jaffa positions, in the space where the energy saturation was most complete, and he was, to any sensor in the room, effectively invisible. The Erden sign went down on the floor in a circle of contained energy, not the standard application, not a trap for a single target, but expanded to its maximum radius, which, in the confined geometry of the gate room, covered the entire floor space from the ramp base to the corridor entrance. It wouldn't stop a Jaffa. It would slow the field, creating enough resistance in the air to make rapid movement feel like moving through deep water. The kind of effect that turned a six-man coordinated assault into six individuals fighting their own momentum. The second Jaffa moved toward his position from the left wall and hit the Irden field 3 steps in. The resistance registered in his face, surprise first. Then the particular frustration of a warrior whose body was not responding to commands correctly, and in that half-second of confusion Geralt was already there. The steel blade flat-sided across the back of the Jaffa's knee, precisely enough force to buckle without permanently damage, the Jaffa going down, controlled rather than dangerous. The third Jaffa fired from the right wall. Geralt rolled under the blast, feeling the staff weapon's heat cross the top of his shoulder close enough to singe leather, came up inside the Jaffa's optimal range, the distance at which the staff weapon was most effective, and closed to the range at which it was useless. His elbow found Jaffa's forearm. The staff weapon clattered on the gate room floor. The Quen sign, applied at contact range, released a kinetic burst that sent the Jaffa back into the wall with enough force to end the engagement without ending the Jaffa. 3 down. 3 remaining, somewhere in the shadows of the gate room, their detector useless, and their formation broken. Geralt went still in the center of the room. The Stargate hummed behind him. He could hear them. Not see the light was wrong, and they were pressed to walls, but hear, because Jaffa symbiotes had a metabolic frequency that he had now catalogued well enough to track. The faint biological signature that was warmer than the room's ambient temperature and rhythmically distinct. 3 of them spread across the room's perimeter, breathing the controlled breath of warriors who were trying to locate him by sound while he was locating them the same way. He let them try for 4 seconds. Then he spoke, in the measured tone he used when he wanted something to hear him clearly. Tell Anubis that what he came for is not here. Tell him the Progenitos are not a resource. Tell him that the next time he sends warriors through a mountain's threshold uninvited, they won't get the version of me that's trying not to cause a diplomatic incident. Silence. Then, from the shadows near the corridor entrance, one of the 3 remaining Jaffa spoke not in Goa'uld, but in accented, formal English that carried the careful precision of someone who had learned the language from intelligence reports rather than conversation. You are one of the 4. The membrane begins. I'm a witcher, Geralt said. From a world where your false god would be a contract. A pause. The Jaffa's symbiote frequency shifted slightly. The biological tell Geralt had learned of a Jaffa processing something that hadn't been in his operational briefing. Anubis knows what you are, the Jaffa said. He has prepared for you. Tell me what he prepared, Geralt said. You will see it, Jaffa said, when the ship arrives. The 3 remaining Jaffa activated personal transponders, simultaneously emergency extraction beacons, the kind that could punch a signal through ring transport even without a ship in direct orbit, designed for exactly the situation of a ground team that had failed its objective and needed immediate retrieval. The ring transport that responded came through the gate room floor itself, the golden ring sweeping down and up in under 3 seconds, and the 3 Jaffa were gone. Geralt stood in the empty gate room, the Stargate humming at his back. 3 unconscious Jaffa on the floor around him, and the specific cold of a warning, received and understood, settling over him like the weather of a place that had made its nature known. Geralt, Carter's voice in his earpiece. Is the gate room clear? Clear, he said. Carter, one of them, spoke. He said, Anubis has prepared for us specifically, and that we'll see it when the ship arrives. A silence on the comm that lasted precisely long enough to mean something. Copy that, Carter said. Get to the briefing room. Now, all teams. The status at 1,600 hours. 31 Jaffa had materialized across the mountain in 9 scattered positions. 28 had been neutralized non-lethally. which had required considerable discipline from all parties and which Hammond would note in his after-action report as an achievement that deserved specific acknowledgement. 3 had been extracted via emergency transponder. The vehicle bay and the Infinity were intact. The ZPM was undamaged. The gate room was clear. The visible Hatak had stopped its approach at 0.4 AU from Earth, just inside the range where Earth's limited orbital defense assets would have to commit to engagement, and was holding. He pulled back, Jack said, from the F302bay.com, his voice carrying the particular texture of a man who had been ready for a fight that hadn't fully materialized. The ground teams failed, the ship stops. Why? Because the ground teams were never the main event, Carter said. She had been running the data since Geralt's report from the gate room, cross-referencing with everything they had, and the picture it made was one she'd been hoping wouldn't assemble itself this clearly. She pulled it up on the briefing room screen as the team filtered in, still carrying the particular alertness of people coming off a defensive action whose adrenaline hadn't fully discharged. The screen showed the solar system schematic, 3 Hatak positions, and a 4th signal emerging from behind the far side of the gas giant at the system's outer edge, not a Hatak. Carter had already confirmed that. Something smaller. Something that was broadcasting a frequency the SGC's systems had no classification for. A signal that her instruments were detecting clearly but couldn't categorize. It had been broadcasting since the ring transport was initiated. 40 minutes of continuous signal building in intensity with each passing minute. That's not a weapon signature, T'Challa said, studying the frequency profile on Carter's screen with the vibranium suit's sensor data overlaid. The energy pattern is resonant, recursive. It's called something. Calling what? Ripley asked. Carter looked at the frequency on her screen, then at the dimensional membrane models she'd been building since Infinity's breach, then at the ancient records Daniel had translated in the Tokra archive. The 3 datasets, which she had been treating as separate streams, had just become one. The frequency matches the dimensional membrane resonance, she said, not the breach frequency, the membrane itself. The natural frequency of Kalach Nor. She looked at the screen, at the small signal source orbiting the gas giant, at the 11-year project called Progenitos that Anubis had been building in secret. He's not calling something from this dimension. He's calling something from between dimensions. He's calling whatever lives in the membrane space, Daniel said. His voice had the particular quality it had when he was working through implications in real time and finding each one more serious than the last. The thing the ancients encountered 40 million years ago. The thing that pushed back. He's figured out how to reach it, Carter said. And he's been preparing this signal for 11 years. The dimensional breach we accidentally caused it didn't just alert him that the Progenitos had arrived. It gave him the last component he needed. The live dimensional frequency signature from an actual breach. He couldn't generate that himself. He needed us to do it for him. The room was quiet, with the quality of quiet that comes after understanding arrives faster than comfort can follow it. He used us, Jack said, not angry beyond anger, into the cold operational space where anger becomes fuel for something more useful. He used the breach, Carter said. He was waiting for any dimensional breach. Ours just happened to be the first one in 40 million years. She looked at the frequency graph, at the signal building in intensity. He's waking up whatever lives in Kalach Nor, and he believes he can control it. He spent 11 years building the containment architecture. What I thought was designed for the Progenitos is actually designed for the membrane entity. The 4 of you were never the target. We were the bait, T'Challa said. The key, Geralt corrected. Something in his voice had shifted the professional calm of a monster hunter who has just received confirmation that what he's dealing with is considerably larger than the initial contract suggested, and who is already restructuring his approach accordingly. In my world, when you want to call something ancient and dangerous, You use something it recognizes, something it already has a connection to. He looked at the four of them, at Ripley, at T'Challa, at Din Djarin, who was holding Grogu's pod against his side with the flat, protective stillness of someone who has understood the tactical picture and does not like it. The membrane space sent us through because it already knew us, Geralt said. Progenitos expected, already known. Anubis is using that connection as a signal. We're not the bait for him, we're the bait for it. Grogu made a sound. Everyone looked at the child, who was looking at the solar system schematic on the briefing room screen with the ancient, patient attention he brought to everything, except that this time the attention had something else in it. Something that was not patience, but recognition. The enormous dark eyes fixed on the small signal source orbiting the gas giant, and one small green hand rose and pointed at it with the precise, deliberate gesture of something that had seen this before. Much, much longer ago than 40 million years. Hammond, Carter said, very quietly. I see it, Hammond said. We need to get to that signal source before it reaches full power, Carter said. And we need to do it with the four of them, because they are the only things in this solar system that the membrane entity already knows and will listen to. She paused. And we need to do it before Anubis realizes his ground assault didn't retrieve what he needed to complete the containment architecture. Which is? Hammond asked. Carter looked at the frequency graph. At the ancient records. The four people who had come through a dimensional breach and landed in a mountain in Colorado 2 days ago because something 40 million years old had arranged for them to be here. A live frequency sample, she said, from one of the Progenitos themselves. She looked at Geralt, at Ripley, at T'Challa, at Din. He sent 31 Jaffa into this mountain, and none of them were carrying weapons. They were carrying collection devices. Din Djarin set Grogu's pod down on the briefing table with a careful, deliberate movement of a man whose operational picture has just been clarified completely and who is now purely in the space of what needs to be done. Then we go to the signal source, Din said, and we end it. The Infinity isn't fully repaired, Carter said. How much of it works? Din asked. Carter looked at her repair notes. 60%, maybe 65%. Can it get us there and back? A pause. Probably. That's enough, Din said. Jack came through the briefing room door at a controlled run, which for Jack O'Neill meant something was on fire, or about to be. He looked at the screen, at the signal source, at the assembled team. The visible Hatak just changed course, he said. It's moving toward the signal source. Anubis is going there too. He looked at Hammond. He knows the ground assault didn't get what he needed. He's going to finish it himself. Hammond looked at the screen for precisely 3 seconds, the interval between receiving decisive information and making a decision about it that Hammond had maintained. Carter had noticed over the years, with the consistency of a man who had decided that 3 seconds was the right amount of time to think before acting and had never found reason to revise it. Get the Infinity prepped, Hammond said. All 8 of you. You have 20 minutes. He looked at the 4 arrivals, at the team that had formed around an accident and a 40-million-year-old arrangement, at the people who had defended his mountain like it was theirs. Whatever is in that membrane space, whatever the ancients found and retreated from you, are the ones it knows. That means you are the ones who have to face it. Geralt looked at the signal on the screen, at the ancient frequency building towards something none of them had words for. In my world, he said, when a monster is older than memory, older than any record, older than the first person who tried to name it, he looked at Hammond. You don't fight it with weapons, you fight it with understanding. He paused. We need to know what it wants before we stand in front of it. Then figure it out on the way, Jack said, already moving. Because we have about 18 minutes before Anubis gets there first, and if a half-ascended false god with 11 years of preparation reaches a 40-million-year-old membrane entity before we do, the only thing that changes is that we're having this conversation from a much worse position. The briefing room emptied in 45 seconds. The Stargate hummed in the room below, patient and ancient and indifferent to the scale of what was using its mountain as a staging ground. And in his pod on the briefing table, Grogu watched the solar system schematic with the eyes of something that remembered Kalach, nor the way mountains remembered oceans, not with thought, but with the deep structural memory of something that had been shaped by a force so fundamental it left its mark in the geology of everything that came after. His small hand stayed pointed at the signal source, waiting. The Infinity left Cheyenne Mountain at 1,623 hours through the expanded vehicle bay roof, the same roof it had crashed through 47 hours ago, now repaired to 60% functionality by Carter's hands and T'Challa's engineering instincts working in relay through the night. The ship rose through Colorado's afternoon sky with the particular grace of something that had been broken and put back together, and was now operating at the exact edge of what its repaired systems could sustain, which Carter was monitoring from the pilot station with the focused attention of someone who understood precisely how thin that edge was. The gas giant's outer orbital path was 11 minutes at the Infinity's maximum drive output. 11 minutes. The number had been following them through this entire operation with the insistence of something that wanted to be noticed. Jack rode in the co-pilot seat because Jack O'Neill, in a vehicle he wasn't flying, was a man whose hands needed something to do, and the co-pilot's console gave them something to do. He ran the sensor suite with the efficiency of someone who had absorbed enough of Carter's teaching over the years to be genuinely useful rather than decoratively present. The visible Hatak was 6 minutes ahead of them, decelerating toward the signal source on a vector that had the precision of a ship following a beacon it had been programmed to find. "He's not going to stop," Jack said, "even knowing we're behind him." "He doesn't need to stop us," Carter said. "He needs to get there first and complete the containment lock before we arrive. If he establishes containment on the membrane entity before we reach it." "He controls Kalak Nor," Daniel said, from the navigation station, where he had the ancient records open on every screen, reading and cross-referencing with the speed of someone who had very little time to understand something very large. Control of the membrane space means control of every dimensional boundary in the galaxy, every parallel reality, every possible branch of every timeline. He looked up. Anubis wouldn't be a system lord anymore. He wouldn't even be a half-ascended being. He'd be something the ascended can't stop because he'd be operating in the space between the planes of existence. "Beyond the reach of the non-interference policy," T'Challa said. "Beyond the reach of everything," Daniel said. The Infinity's drive pushed harder. Carter coaxed another 3% from the ZPM housing, the repaired conduits holding with the specific stubbornness of work done under pressure by people who needed it to hold. In the cargo hold, the 4 arrivals were in the space that had become, in the last 47 hours, the closest thing to their own territory inside the Infinity. Not assigned, not designated, simply the place they had defaulted to when the mountain's corridors had needed navigating together, the place where the 4 of them had become, without ceremony or declaration, something that functioned like a unit. Geralt had his silver blade across his knees, running a whetstone along the edge with the rhythmic, meditative motion of a man who processed through his hands. He had been doing this since they'd lifted off, not because the blade needed sharpening, but because the rhythm organized thought. Ripley sat across from him, her pulse rifle broken down to its components on the cargo hold floor, each piece inspected, reassembled, inspected again. The same discipline as Geralt's whetstone. Different instrument, same function. T'Challa stood with his back to the hull, the vibranium suit running passive scans on the signal source ahead, feeding data to Carter's station. His eyes were open, but focused somewhere interior, the place kings went when they were performing the arithmetic of consequence, tallying what a decision would cost against what not making it would cost more. Din Djarin sat with Grogu's pod open beside him, the child's small hand resting on his gauntlet with the familiar, uncomplicated weight of complete trust. Dean was not doing anything with his hands. He was simply present with the child in the way that Carter had observed, becoming his primary mode of processing. Not thinking around the situation, but sitting in the middle of it, armor and all, and letting it be what it was. When we reach it, Geralt said, not looking up from the blade. Whatever the membrane entity is, the ancient records called it aware, but not conscious. Carter said, responsive, but not thinking. Something in between, Ripley said, reassembling the rifle with the practiced efficiency of 10,000 repetitions. Something that organized the dimensional membranes. T'Challa said, something that has been waiting 40 million years for a specific convergence. He looked at Grogu. Something the child remembers. They all looked at Grogu. The child looked back at each of them in turn. Geralt, Ripley, T'Challa, Din, with the ancient, patient attention that had been, since the first moment of their arrival, directed outward at everything. A constant cataloging. A continuous recognition. He's been looking at us since we arrived, Din said. Not curious, not afraid. He looked at his gauntlet where Grogu's hand rested. Like he already knew us. Progenitos, Geralt said. Expected. He's one of us, Ripley said. It was not a question. The cargo hold was quiet for a moment. 5, T'Challa said. Not 4. Grogu made the sound they had each, in their own way, learned to read as confirmation. The signal source resolved on the Infinity's forward sensors at 1,634 hours. Not a ship, as Carter had confirmed, but a device. Ancient manufacture, the energy signature unmistakable, approximately 3 meters across, and currently active at 80% of what Carter's models suggested was its maximum output. It looked, on the visual feed, like a smaller version of the Stargate, a ring, not lying flat like the gate but oriented vertically, edge-on to the gas giant's gravitational field, spinning slowly in a frequency that matched Kalach-Nor's natural resonance exactly. An ancient tuning fork, built 40 million years ago, left here in the dark of the outer solar system for exactly this. The Hatak had arrived 90 seconds earlier and was already deploying ring transport to the device's position. He's there, Jack said. Carter, I see it. She was already calculating an intercept. We can't outrun the ring transport. He has people at the device. How many? 6, and Anubis himself. A pause. His personal transport just activated. He's going down. Jack looked at the visual feed at the ancient ring spinning in the outer dark, at the Hatak holding position above it, at the half-ascended false god who had been building toward this moment for 11 years, descending toward the threshold between dimensions in a beam of ring transport gold. Options, Jack said. 1, Carter said. We go through the gate. There's no gate. There is, Carter said. She pulled up the frequency analysis on the main screen. The ancient device is broadcasting Kalach-Nor's resonance frequency. At current output, it's functionally equivalent to a dimensional gate address. We can use Infinity ZPM to dial it. She looked at the screen, at the math she'd been running for the last 11 minutes. We can go through. I know. Into the membrane space, Daniel said. Into Kalach-Nor, Carter said. Yes. Where the thing that stopped the ancients 40 million years ago lives, Jack said. Also yes, Carter. I know, she said. But Anubis is already down there, or will be in 30 seconds. If we don't follow him, he completes the containment, and it doesn't matter where we are. She looked at Hammond's comm frequency on her panel. The general had stayed at the SGC, coordinating Earth's conventional defense, and she had kept him apprised of every development with the discipline of an officer who understood that the man at the command post needed to know everything his forward teams knew. General? Hammond's voice came through the static of the outer solar system. I heard all of it, Colonel. A pause. Do what needs to be done. Carter dialed Kalach-Nor. The membrane space was not dark. It was the color of everything that existed before color had anything to reflect off a luminescence that was not light in the standard physical sense, but the visual representation of pure dimensional structure. The membranes themselves visible as vast curved surfaces extending in directions that had no names, each one a universe, each one pressing close against the next, with the intimate architecture of things that have always been adjacent. The infinity crossed the threshold and went still. No drive required, no navigation. Kalakhnor held them in the same way gravity held planets, not restraining, but orienting, providing the reference point around which everything organized. Anubis was already there. He stood, if standing was the word for a half-ascended being's relationship with space, that had no floor at the center of the membrane space, in the configuration his half-ascended nature allowed. Partly physical, partly energy, the Goa'uld host body, wrapped in the dark energy field that had been, for 3 seasons of the SGC's war, the most dangerous thing in the galaxy. In his hands that were and were not hands, he held the containment architecture he had spent 11 years building, a device that Carter's instruments immediately identified as an ancient design, reverse-engineered and corrupted, its original purpose of communion with Kalakh, nor twisted into the architecture of control. He looked at the infinity with the particular expression of someone whose plan has encountered an unexpected variable and who is deciding, in real time, whether the variable changes the plan or the plan absorbs the variable. "You followed," Anubis said. His voice in Kalakhnor had no echo because there was nothing for sound to bounce from, but it carried with the absolute clarity of something speaking in a space built entirely for transmission. "I had not modeled this specifically, but it changes nothing." "It changes everything," Jack said, from the infinity's calm. "Because you're not finishing that containment." "You cannot stop me here," Anubis said. "In this space, your weapons have no reference. Your gate has no address to return to. You are as trapped as I intend to make it." He activated the containment device. The membrane space responded. Kalakhnor moved, not with violence, not with the defensive aggression of something threatened. It moved the way deep water moves when something large shifts within it, the entire membrane structure rippling outward from the containment device's activation point, the luminescent surfaces flexing and brightening. And in the brightening, something that had been present the entire time became visible. Not a creature, not a being in any form the word suggested. A pattern. An organizing structure woven through the membranes themselves, the thing that had arranged them, that had been arranging them for longer than the galaxy had existed, that had pushed back against the ancients 40 million years ago, not in anger, but in the same way an immune system responds to something foreign, recognizing the intrusion and redirecting it. It looked at the containment device. Then it looked at the infinity. Then it looked, with a focus that every person aboard felt as a physical pressure against their consciousness, at the 5 Progenitos. "Now," Geralt said. The cargo hold door opened, and the 5 of them stepped into Kalakhnor. There was no atmosphere. There was no need for one. The membrane space provided what was needed for what was present, and what was present included 5 beings it had selected across 40 million years of patient arrangement. Geralt held no weapon. He had sheathed both blades before they crossed the threshold because he had spent the 11 minutes of the journey understanding what Carter and Daniel's research had been pointing toward. And a Witcher who has understood the nature of what he faces does not approach it with a weapon, he approaches it with truth. "You didn't bring us here to fight," he said, to the pattern in the membranes, to the organizing structure of Kalakhnor. "You brought us here because Anubis was coming and you needed something he couldn't contain." The pattern moved not toward him, but through the space between them, the way understanding moves between minds that have found a common frequency. "Witnesses," Daniel said beside him, his voice carrying the hushed quality of a scholar who has arrived at the primary source of everything he has spent his life studying. It needed witnesses. Beings from outside this dimension, with no stake in this galaxy's politics, with no history with the ancients or the Goa'uld. Clean testimony. He looked at the membrane surfaces, at the universes pressing close on every side. The ancients couldn't be the witnesses. They built this. Anubis can't be the witness. He wants to own it. The SGC can't be the witness. They have too much to gain. He looked at Geralt, at Ripley, at T'Challa, at Din, and Grogu. You're from outside. You have no claim on this space. Your testimony is clean. Testimony about what? Ripley said. That it exists? T'Challa said. Understanding arriving in the particular way it arrived for him from the periphery inward, from the implications toward the center. That it is not a resource, not a weapon, not a tool. He looked at the pattern in the membranes. Kalach Nor is a place of its own nature, with its own purpose, which has nothing to do with what any civilization in any dimension wants from it. He paused. By having beings from outside bear witness to that nature, beings who have no agenda, it establishes a record, a testimony that exists outside any single universe's ability to revise. Grogu made a sound. The pattern in the membranes responded to it, not to anything the five of them had said, to the child, because Grogu's connection to Kalach Nor was not intellectual or observational. It was structural, the force. The energy field that bound his universe together was itself a membrane space phenomenon, the thin place between dimensions where consciousness could reach through. He had been feeling Kalach Nor his entire life, the way fish feel water, as the medium through which everything moved. He reached both small green hands toward the pattern. The pattern came to meet him. What happened in the next 30 seconds had no precise description in any language that any of the 8 humans aboard the Infinity had available to them. Carter's instruments recorded an energy event of extraordinary magnitude. Daniel's notes captured fragments of ancient linguistic structure that the pattern apparently used as a channel for communication. The nearest ancient analog being, in his later translation, something between acknowledgement and recognition and release. What Anubis experienced was the containment device becoming inert in his hands, not destroyed, not overloaded, simply emptied of function, the way a trap becomes inert when the thing it was set for steps around it rather than into it. The reverse-engineered ancient architecture in the device had been built around the assumption that Kalach Nor was a resource to be captured. What the 5 Progenitos had provided, what Grogu had transmitted through the Force into the membrane structure, was the specific frequency that told the organizing pattern it was already known, already witnessed, already testified to. The trap had nothing to close on. Anubis looked at the inert device in his hands, then at the 5 beings standing in the membrane space he had spent 11 years trying to own. Then at Kalach Nor itself, at the pattern woven through the membranes, which was now, with the testimony of the Progenitos embedded in its structure, simply not available to be claimed, not defended. Not aggressive, just not available, the way a truth that has been fully spoken cannot be unsaid. You cannot hold what does not wish to be held, T'Challa said to him, quietly. Without triumph, because triumph was for victories that had cost something, and this one had cost enough. You should know this. You've spent 100 years failing to hold what you already had. Anubis looked at him with the eyes of a being caught between 2 states of existence for so long that both had become foreign. Then Kalach Nor made its final statement in the language of dimensional physics rather than words. The membrane space contracted gently around Anubis's position, not crushing, but redirecting. The organizing pattern, turning the half-ascended system, Lord's presence, in the membrane space into a transition rather than a destination. The ascended planes had rules. Things that were half of one plane and half of another could not remain in the space between all planes indefinitely. Kalach Nor had simply declined to be the place where Anubis's ambition found its footing. He was gone. Not destroyed, not killed, redirected into the ascended plane with the gentle, absolute authority of a space that had been organizing things far longer than Anubis had existed, and had no particular opinion about him, except that he was a pattern that did not belong in this one. The three Hatak in the outer solar system went dark simultaneously, their command structure severed. Jaffa crews suddenly operating without orders in a solar system that had just demonstrated it was more complicated than their briefings had suggested. Kalach-Nor released the Infinity gently, the membrane space returning to its organizing quiet, the luminescent surfaces settling back into their vast, curved patience. The Infinity crossed the threshold in reverse and was back in normal space, the outer solar system around them, the gas giant turning slowly in the amber light, the ancient device spinning down to standby. Carter looked at her instruments for a long moment. "ZPM is stable," she said. "All systems holding." She looked at the Hatak positions on her screen. 3 dark ships, their crews alive and leaderless and deeply confused. "I'm reading command structure collapse on all 3 Hatak. Bratac's network is going to have a busy week." "Good week for the Free Jaffa," Teal'c said. "Good week for everyone," Jack said. In the cargo hold, Grogu was asleep in his pod, the deep, boneless sleep of something that had completed a significant expenditure of the thing that powered it. Small hands finally still, ears relaxed, the ancient eyes closed. Din had the pod sealed and resting against his side, and was looking at nothing in particular, with the expression he wore when he was feeling something he had not yet found the words for. Ripley sat beside him, said nothing. Let the silence be what it was, because she had learned a long time ago that some things didn't need language to be real. And the particular silence between 2 people who had just survived something together and knew it was of that kind. T'Challa stood at the Infinity's forward viewport, looking at the gas giant and the ancient device spinning quietly in its orbital path. His mind was doing what it always did after a significant event, running the implications forward, calculating what this would mean for the galaxy's political structure, for the Tokra, for the Free Jaffa, for the question of what Earth's position in this galaxy's future now looked like, with 3 leaderless Hatak and a membrane space that had just demonstrated it was its own sovereign entity. Geralt stood beside him. "Your world," T'Challa said after a moment. "What you left behind when the Infinity pulled you through. It will still be there," Geralt said. The certainty in it was not forced. It was the certainty of someone who understood that the world doesn't stop because you've stepped out of it temporarily. Monsters don't wait, neither do contracts. A pause. Neither do the people who hire you. "Jaskier will be composing a very dramatic song about your absence," T'Challa said. Because Daniel had shared Geralt's biographical summary with the team, and T'Challa had read everything Daniel gave him. Geralt closed his eyes briefly. Undoubtedly. The debrief at Cheyenne Mountain lasted 4 hours, which was abbreviated by SGC standards, but sufficient to establish the official record. Anubis had been redirected by Kalach-Nor into the ascended plane. The 3 Hatak had been secured by a combination of Prometheus boarding actions and Free Jaffa, who had been waiting for exactly this kind of command structure collapse. The ancient device had returned to dormancy, and the dimensional membrane of Kalach-Nor had, in Carter's technical assessment, sealed itself from future interference with the elegance of something that had been waiting 40 million years to do exactly that. Hammond submitted his report to the Pentagon with the particular concision of a man who understood that the full truth, delivered without context to people who hadn't been there, produced outcomes nobody wanted. The classified addendum, which fewer than 10 people would ever read, contained Carter's full-dimensional membrane analysis, Daniel's translation of the Progenitos records, and a note that read, "In Hammond's precise military prose, the 4-dimensional arrivals performed beyond any reasonable expectation in every phase of this operation. Recommend, commendation for all. Further recommend SGC develop a formal framework for potential future dimensional arrivals." This will not be the last. He had looked at that last sentence for a long time before leaving it in. It stayed in. The question of returning home was not simple, but it was answerable. Carter had spent 18 hours with T'Challa reverse engineering the dimensional breach mechanics from the Infinity's ZPM event data, and what they had built together was not a repeatable, general-purpose dimensional travel system. The membrane space had made clear, in the way Kalach Nor made things clear, that it was not a road to be used casually, but a set of 4 specific return coordinates, 4-dimensional addresses, each one a thread leading back to the exact membrane point from which each Progenitos had been pulled. One way, precisely calibrated, non-repeatable, 4 doors home. Hammond held the final briefing in the gate room itself, not the briefing room above, but the gate room floor, the Stargate at their backs, the iris open, the whole circular machinery of 10,000 worlds present as witness. It was not protocol. It was recognition. The SGC owes each of you a debt, Hammond said, with the directness of a man who did not use that word lightly, that doesn't have an equivalent in our accounting systems. You defended this mountain. You went into a space no human has entered in 40 million years, and you did it without hesitation and without complaint. He looked at each of them. Whatever world you're from, you're the kind of people this galaxy needs. Ripley looked at the Stargate, then at Hammond. You're going to have more of these, she said. Not dimensional arrivals necessarily, but things that come through that gate that you don't have categories for, things that are bigger than your current threat models, unquote. We know, Hammond said. Build better threat models, she said, and stop apologizing for the coffee. It's fine. End quote. Hammond almost smiled, noted. T'Challa shook Hammond's hand, then Carter's, then Daniel's, with the formal gravity of a king completing a diplomatic engagement that had exceeded its brief. I will remember what this galaxy taught me, he said, about isolation and its costs. About what happens when a civilization decides its knowledge is too advanced for the world. He looked at the Stargate. Wakanda has been making that decision for a long time. A pause. I think I'm ready to revisit it. He shook Jack's hand last. Jack looked at him. Good king, Jack said, which was not a compliment he gave without meaning it. Good soldier, T'Challa replied, which for him meant the same thing. Geralt said his farewells in the way he did most things, without ceremony and without deficit. He clasped Teal'c's forearm in the grip of one warrior to another, and Teal'c returned it with the gravity it deserved. He looked at Daniel's notebook, at the 3 pages of notes Daniel had taken from their conversations, and said nothing about them, but let the silence acknowledge that he knew they were there and found it acceptable. He looked at Grogu, who was awake in his open pod, watching Geralt with the ancient eyes. Whatever you are, Geralt said to him, take care of yourself. Grogu made the sound that meant you too. Din Djarin was last. He stood in the gate room with Grogu's pod held in the crook of his left arm and looked at Teal'c for a long moment at the man who had been his counterpart in the sub-basement corridors, who had spoken of Kel Makta and warrior forging and the self that training reveals, who had been on a different path to the same place for 30 years. Your teacher, Din said. Bratac. He's still out there. He is, Teal'c said. Don't take that for granted, Din said. Teal'c held his gaze. I have not, he said. I will not. Din nodded, put his helmet on. The Beskar, face closed. The Infinity's return coordinate system was ready. Carter had integrated the 4-dimensional addresses into the ZPM breach sequence. Not a gate dial, not a ring transport, but something in between. A controlled version of what had happened accidentally 47 hours ago. Clean, precise. Each Progenitos returned to within 30 seconds of their departure point, the membrane space accommodating the return with the same patient architecture it had used to arrange the arrival. They went through in sequence. T'Challa first, a shimmer of vibranium, in the gate room light, and then the space where he had been, and then nothing. Ripley, who looked at the gate room one last time with the eyes of a woman cataloging an exit, filing it with every other exit she had ever memorized, and then stepped into the return shimmer with the flat, practical courage that had always been her most fundamental quality. Geralt, who paused at the threshold and looked back at the Stargate, the ring of ancient metal connecting 10,000 worlds, built by beings who had ascended beyond the need for it and left it running, and said nothing, but looked at it for long enough that the looking said everything. Then through. Din Djarin last. He stood at the threshold with Grogu's pod against his chest, the child's eyes open, watching the gate room with the ancient patience of something that has been many places and understands that leaving is not the same as ending. "Thank you," Din said, to no one specifically and to all of them. Then watch the gate. He stepped through. The membrane shimmer dissolved. The gate room held the silence of a space from which something significant had recently departed, the particular quality of absence that is itself a presence. The kind that makes people stand still for a moment before resuming whatever they had been doing. Jack stood in the gate room for approximately 10 seconds, looking at the space where 4 people from 4 dimensions had stood 12 seconds ago. Then he looked at the Stargate. "Well," he said. "Yeah," Daniel said. "Carter." "Sir, how's the ZPM?" Carter looked at her instruments. "Stable. Dimensional breach fully sealed. Kalach Nor is dormant." A pause. "We're not going to be able to open it again. Not intentionally, not accidentally. The membrane space has..." She looked at the readings. "It sealed itself from this end. Completely." "Good," Jack said. He meant it. Some doors were better closed. He looked at the Stargate one more time. At the ring that had been here before Cheyenne Mountain, before Colorado, before the United States of America, before the civilization that had built all of it. At the thing that connected everything. "Hammond's going to write a hell of a report," Jack said. "He always does," Carter said. "Daniel, already started mine," Daniel said. "Teal'c, indeed," Teal'c said, which covered everything. Jack finished his coffee, set the cup on the gate room ramp with the comfortable ease of a man in a place that was, against considerable odds, still standing. Somewhere in the Kalium asteroid system, the Free Jaffa were moving on 3 leaderless Hatak. Somewhere in the Tokra network, the Progenitos records were being added to an archive that had been waiting 40 million years for the entry. Somewhere in Kalach Nor, the organizing pattern of the membrane space continued its patient, ancient work, the same work it had been doing since before the first Stargate was built, before the first civilization reached for the stars, before anyone had a word for the space between what was known and what waited to be known. And in the SGC's mission files, in the classified archive that future generations of gate teams would read and argue about and try to understand, Hammond's after-action report concluded with a single line that Carter would find, years later, more precise than any technical analysis she had written. They came from elsewhere. They defended what was ours. They left it standing. That is sufficient. Conclusion. 47 hours. That was all it had taken, from the ZPM's unscheduled dimensional sneeze to the last shimmer of a Mandalorian's return threshold for a mountain in Colorado to become the place where the oldest thing in the galaxy chose to resolve a 40-million-year-old arrangement. The SGC would continue. The gate would dial. SG-1 would step through into whatever the galaxy had prepared for the next mission, and the mission after that, and all the missions that the Gate Network held in its 10,000 addresses. The work didn't end because something extraordinary had happened. It continued because the extraordinary had always been the baseline, and the people doing the work had long since made their peace with that. What remained was subtler than victory. 3 leaderless Hatak, becoming the Free Jaffa's most significant resource gain in a decade. A Tokra archive updated with testimony that no Goa'uld could now revise or suppress. A Wakandan king returning home with his father's question, answered in a way that would take years to fully understand and a lifetime to fully act on. A witcher returning to his contracts with the specific quiet of someone who has seen the machinery behind the world and found it, if not comforting, at least coherent. A Mandalorian flying home with a sleeping child through a galaxy that had tried very hard to take everything from him and had, again, failed. And in Kalach Nor, in the space that listens, in the patient architecture between everything, the 5 frequencies that had briefly been present in the membrane space remained as testimony. The Witcher? Why? The survivor, the king, the Mandalorian, the child, expected, witnessed, released. The gate addresses of 4 other dimensions, now sealed, would remain in the SGC's database, not as destinations, but as records. Proof that the boundaries between realities were not walls, but membranes. That what existed on the other side was not threat, but parallel. That the universe, in its infinite complexity, had more rooms than any single civilization could map. And somewhere in the deep structure of Kalach Nur, already patient, already watching, the next arrangement was beginning. The gate had 10,000 addresses. The galaxy had more. Is greater than, is greater than, is greater than, indeed. More stories await.